Before the moment writing emerged to dominate human memory, there existed a class of individuals who moved through ancient temples and observatories with a purpose that later civilizations would forget to comprehend. They wore robes, yes, but these weren't the vestments of mystics speaking in riddles. These were the garments of researchers. Ancient priests were the astronomers, the mathematicians, the architects, and the healers of their time. They were humanity's first scientists, though we've buried that truth so deeply beneath layers of religious narrative that most of us have stopped looking for it. Consider for a moment what these individuals understood. They mapped the movements of celestial bodies with a precision that rivals instruments we consider modern. They calculated astronomical positions with accuracy that, when modern scientists analyzed their surviving records, created something close to bewilderment. How did they know? Without telescopes, without computers, without the mathematics we believe necessary for such calculation. Yet the evidence persists, carved in stone, encoded in architecture, preserved in texts that survived destruction through methods we're only now beginning to understand. In Egypt, the priesthood didn't simply observe the stars from temple rooftops. They calculated. They used mathematical ratios that connected pyramid height to planetary movements. The dimensions weren't arbitrary. Every measurement encoded information. In Mesopotamia, the priesthood tracked Venus with such consistency across such extended observation periods that their records suggest an understanding of celestial mechanics that shouldn't exist at that historical moment. They built observation systems that persisted across generations, ensuring that no single priest's death would interrupt centuries of accumulated data. They understood something fundamental, that true understanding requires time, longer than a human lifetime, longer than a dynasty. They built systems designed to outlast individuals and institutions. The priesthood in India took a different approach entirely, yet arrived at a comparable destination. They encoded astronomical knowledge into religious texts using memorization systems so sophisticated, so effective, that when modern researchers compared different versions of these texts, preserved across 3,500 years by different schools in different geographic regions, they discovered variation of less than 1%. Less than 1% across 35 centuries of human transmission. That's not religious devotion. That's engineering. That's technology applied to the fragile medium of human memory. In the Americas, the priesthood created calendrical systems of such mathematical complexity that when modern computers attempted to verify their accuracy, researchers discovered something troubling. The calendars weren't just accurate. They were calibrated to cycles of such extraordinary length that they implied an understanding of time that goes beyond observation. They suggest either inherited knowledge or observation records spanning periods far longer than any single civilization should require. Why would a priesthood invest enormous resources into tracking cycles that wouldn't complete for hundreds of thousands of years, unless they believed that knowledge needed to survive that long? Unless they anticipated that future priesthoods would need to understand these cycles, unless they were preparing for something. This is what the evidence reveals when we stop expecting ancient people to be primitive. The priesthoods of Egypt and Mesopotamia and India and the Americas weren't isolated developments, each independently fumbling toward understanding. There was something unified about their approach. The same obsessions appeared across civilizations separated by oceans and centuries. The same methods for preserving knowledge. The same mathematical principles. The same astronomical focus. They treated celestial cycles as sacred not because they were superstitious, but because they recognized these cycles as fundamental. The movement of the stars was language. It was instruction. It was a record of something that mattered. What bound these priesthoods together was their understanding of a single principle. Knowledge dies unless deliberately protected. Empires fall, temples burn, populations scatter, libraries crumble. But if knowledge is encoded into multiple forms, written text and architecture, and ritual and symbol, and memorized tradition, if it's distributed across multiple priesthoods in different locations, if it's embedded so skillfully into the cultural fabric that it survives, even when the priesthood institutions collapse, then knowledge can persist. It can wait. It can communicate across centuries to people who need to hear its message. But this raises a question that grows more pressing as we examine the evidence. If priesthoods across the entire ancient world were unified in their commitment to preserving specific knowledge they considered essential to human civilization itself, where did that knowledge come from? What was so important that different cultures, with no documented contact with one another, independently developed identical systems to protect it? The coincidences accumulate in a way that stops feeling like coincidence. When you examine them individually, you can dismiss each one. When you step back and perceive them as a pattern, dismissal becomes difficult, perhaps impossible. On opposite sides of a planet, separated by oceans that couldn't be crossed by any documented technology of their era, two civilizations developed observational astronomy systems that mirror each other with startling precision. The Mayan priesthood positioned their temples to capture sunlight on specific celestial dates. The Egyptian priesthood built structures aligned to stellar positions. Both civilizations developed calendars that tracked multiple overlapping cycles. Both created mathematical systems far more sophisticated than their supposed technological level should allow. Both organized their entire societies around priestly knowledge systems. Both treated astronomical observation as the most sacred responsibility of their priesthood. How does this happen by accident? The Vedic priesthood in India developed a system for transmitting oral knowledge so effective, so resilient, that texts have survived 3,500 years of human transmission with near-perfect accuracy. The system wasn't based on writing. It relied on memorization, on rhythm, on encoded patterns that trained the brain to recognize errors automatically. If a word was mispronounced, if a syllable fell out of place, the trained ear detected it immediately. The whole system was a self-correcting mechanism. Meanwhile, simultaneously in Mesopotamia, a different priesthood was developing written systems specifically designed to preserve the same category of knowledge, astronomical observation. They weren't writing poetry, they weren't recording mythology, they were creating databases. They were encoding data into cuneiform with such precision that modern researchers can still extract specific astronomical information from tablets that have survived 5,000 years. In Egypt, this same impulse manifested differently again. Priesthoods designed tombs as information storage systems. Mathematics was embedded in pyramid proportions. Astronomical knowledge was encoded into the very angles and alignments of structures designed to last millennia. The priesthood understood architecture as a medium for preserving information. Every measurement meant something. Every alignment communicated data to those trained to read it. 3 different civilizations, 3 entirely different media for the same essential project. Knowledge preservation. The deeper pattern emerges when you examine what knowledge they prioritized above all else. Every major priesthood invested resources that seemed disproportionate into understanding celestial cycles. They weren't curious about stars as abstract objects. They were tracking something, recording it, predicting it. They developed mathematical systems specifically designed to handle these calculations. They created hierarchical priesthoods where knowledge was compartmentalized, ensuring that if one priest died or one temple was destroyed, the knowledge persisted in other locations. They trained successors with obsessive care, sometimes for years, ensuring that the transfer of knowledge was perfect. This wasn't spirituality. This was operational security applied to information transmission. What's remarkable is that they treated this knowledge as sacred, not in a religious sense, but in a protective sense. They surrounded it with ritual. They restricted access. They embedded it in allegory and symbol and narrative. But they did this because they understood something that institutional authorities would later try to suppress. Knowledge is power, and power structures resist the distribution of knowledge. If priesthoods possessed understanding that contradicted whatever political or religious authority governed them, that knowledge needed protection. It needed to be preserved in forms that couldn't easily be destroyed or suppressed. Think about what this means. Ancient priesthoods across multiple continents, with no documented communication, independently arrived at nearly identical conclusions about how knowledge should be organized, preserved, and transmitted. They concluded that astronomical cycles were essential to understanding something about civilization itself. They concluded that certain knowledge needed to survive for periods of extraordinary length. They concluded that no single priest or institution could be trusted to maintain knowledge alone. Therefore, they built redundancy into their systems. They created backup systems. They ensured that even if everything failed, some knowledge would survive in some form, waiting for a future generation that would know how to interpret it. Which suggests that the knowledge they were protecting wasn't generated by any single priesthood. It wasn't unique to Egypt or Mesopotamia or India or Mesoamerica. It was inherited, received, transmitted from an even more ancient source that we've lost. And if priesthoods unified across the ancient world were dedicated to preserving this knowledge, protecting it, encoding it in multiple forms, that means it was urgently important. It means they believed something significant depended on it surviving. They didn't build these systems for idle curiosity. They built them because they understood that civilizations fall, that knowledge dies, and that some knowledge is too important to lose. The systematic suppression of priesthood knowledge didn't announce itself. No proclamation declared that everything the priesthoods understood would be deliberately obscured. It happened gradually, quietly, so subtly that by the time the process was complete, most people had stopped realizing anything had been lost at all. The mechanism was straightforward, though its execution took centuries. As political power consolidated and organized religions became institutionalized, the independence of priesthood knowledge systems became problematic. Priesthoods held authority independent of state or religious institution. They possessed knowledge that wasn't distributed through official channels. They maintained traditions that predated current political structures. This autonomy was tolerable as long as religious and political authorities could absorb priesthood knowledge into their own frameworks. But when priesthood knowledge began to conflict with official doctrine, when astronomical observations suggested that cosmological models were incorrect, when mathematical principles implied relationships that contradicted religious teaching, the conflict became impossible to ignore. The priesthoods had preserved knowledge through multiple channels, written texts in temples, architectural encoding in the very structure of buildings, oral traditions maintained through disciplined memorization, ritual practices that embedded information into ceremonial action, symbolic systems that expressed complex principles through visual representation. This redundancy had served them well. It meant that knowledge could survive through one medium even if others were destroyed. But it also meant that to completely suppress knowledge, you had to attack all channels simultaneously. And that's what happened. Libraries burned, sometimes in the chaos of warfare, sometimes deliberately, by authorities who recognized that certain texts contained knowledge that undermined official narratives. The Library of Alexandria stands as the most famous example, but it wasn't unique. Hundreds of temples were destroyed, their architectural knowledge lost, their symbolic systems obscured beneath new construction. Priesthoods that resisted institutional incorporation were persecuted, their followers scattered, their teachings labeled as superstition or heresy. This wasn't subtle, this was force. But force alone wasn't sufficient. The truly effective suppression required something more insidious. It required reframing. The destruction of priesthood knowledge wasn't presented as suppression. It was presented as enlightenment. Religious authorities claimed they were replacing superstition with truth. They were moving civilization from darkness into light. They were establishing proper order. The narrative was powerful because it contained elements of truth. Some priesthood practices were superstitious. Some incorporated elements that were dangerous or ineffective. But in the process of removing superstition, authorities removed genuine knowledge as well. They didn't distinguish between superstition and science. They simply suppressed anything that contradicted their authority. The priesthoods that survived did so through adaptation. They didn't resist openly. They learned to work within new frameworks. They embedded their astronomical knowledge into religious texts. Celestial cycles became divine mysteries. Mathematical principles became spiritual truths. Astronomical observations became prophecies. They preserved the knowledge, but they transformed its appearance. To a casual observer, it looked like religious narrative. To someone trained in the old systems, it was still technical information. The knowledge survived, but its context was corrupted. Its meaning was obscured. Each generation of priesthood that received this hidden knowledge received it in more distorted form. A mathematical principle transmitted through religious allegory loses precision. Procedural information transmitted through ritual loses clarity. By the time several generations had passed, what remained was a shadow of the original knowledge. What's particularly insidious about this process is that it looked like natural historical development. It appeared that religious frameworks simply replaced priesthood traditions because religion was more powerful or more compelling. In fact, institutional structures deliberately suppressed priesthood knowledge systems while simultaneously preserving selected elements of that knowledge in disguised forms. The mechanism was almost perfect. It allowed authorities to eliminate the institutional structures through which knowledge was transmitted and understood, while preserving fragments of the knowledge itself in forms that couldn't be easily interpreted or applied. Future generations would possess the pieces, but lack the frameworks to understand them. The evidence of this erasure surrounds us. Temple after temple was repurposed or destroyed. Oral traditions were suppressed, as writing became the only legitimate form of knowledge. Priesthoods that maintained independence were marginalized and scattered. What survived was compartmentalized. Knowledge that had been unified, connected to philosophy, to mathematics, to astronomy, to practical application, was fragmented into isolated pieces, preserved in different institutions, interpreted through different lenses, often contradicting each other because the unified framework that would reconcile them was gone. But erasure was never complete. Fragments survived. In architecture, in symbols, in obscure texts, in ritual practices that persisted in folk traditions, the priests left traces, breadcrumbs, messages designed to survive destruction, messages waiting for someone to recognize them, messages that, when followed carefully back through centuries of distortion and suppression, might reveal what was hidden. Egyptian priesthoods that served at Heliopolis and Thebes operated according to a principle that wouldn't be formally articulated in modern science until centuries later. They functioned not primarily as spiritual authorities, but as research institutions disguised behind temple walls and sacred ceremony. To walk through recorded history with sufficient attention is to notice something peculiar about these priesthoods that conventional narratives have obscured. They weren't principally concerned with dispensing spiritual blessings or maintaining religious doctrine in the way we typically imagine. Their fundamental obsession was data, astronomical data, specifically. Centuries of it, millennia of it. They understood something that modern scientists would need lifetimes to prove. You cannot understand the cosmos if your observation window is limited to a single human lifetime. Understanding requires time. Understanding requires generations of researchers dedicated to identical questions, collecting data points that form patterns too vast to perceive within a single existence. Each priest, who underwent training at Heliopolis, spent years learning what modern observers might call advanced astronomy. But that terminology diminishes what it represented. These weren't lecture halls presenting theoretical knowledge. These were observatories where knowledge was earned through direct observation and systematic measurement. The young priest memorized the positions of planets at specific times. He learned where Venus appeared in the eastern sky before sunrise. He studied the predictable movements of Saturn. He understood which stars rose at particular times during different seasons, which crossed the meridian at specific hours, which disappeared below the horizon when. He acquired this knowledge through direct observation, through repetition, through a methodology so rigorous it resembles modern scientific protocol. These priest observers possessed tools that enabled precision across decades of continuous measurement. Water clocks measured time with consistency, independent of weather. Shadow instruments tracked the sun's position across the year. Star charts allowed them to mark celestial positions with mathematical notation refined through generations. What distinguishes their approach wasn't merely possessing tools. It was their understanding of why precision mattered. They grasped that measurement errors accumulate. Tiny inaccuracies, multiplied across years, corrupt the entire record. Therefore, they developed systems to check themselves. They cross-verified observations. They maintained redundant records. They built safeguards ensuring that if one measurement was corrupted, others would exist to reveal the error and allow correction. Their astronomical knowledge wasn't theoretical exercise. It was applied knowledge, directly applied, continuously applied. The pyramids themselves stand as physical manifestation of this knowledge, translated into stone. We've been taught that pyramids functioned as tombs, as monuments to deceased monarchs. Examine them with understanding that these structures embodied mathematical principles and astronomical alignments, and perception shifts fundamentally. The Great Pyramid's dimensions encode mathematical relationships that shouldn't be possible for a civilization without formal calculus. Its angles align precisely to specific stars. The proportions within its structure reflect astronomical cycles, translated into stone geometry. The internal chambers appear constructed according to ratios corresponding to celestial movements. The precision required for this construction wasn't matched by Western science until the Renaissance arrived 1,000 years later. Think about what that means. Centuries of supposedly continuous scientific progress, and Western civilization still hadn't recovered the mathematical sophistication that Egyptian priesthoods applied routinely to architectural projects. What knowledge was lost? What does this suggest about how easily sophisticated understanding can vanish from a civilization? The priesthood also maintained what we'd recognize as libraries, though not public ones. These were restricted archives. Temple libraries where accumulated knowledge existed in papyrus scrolls, architectural plans, and numerical tables. Access was restricted severely. Only priests, demonstrating sufficient understanding and ideological commitment, were permitted to study sensitive materials. This compartmentalization was intentional and strategic. Different priests specialized in different domains. One might maintain all recorded observations of Mercury. Another preserved the complete Venus cycle record. Another safeguarded the mathematical systems. No single individual possessed complete understanding of the entire knowledge system. This appears as vulnerability. In reality, it was resilience. If one priest was compromised, if one priesthood branch was suppressed, if one temple section was destroyed, knowledge persisted elsewhere, in other minds, in other locations. It was a distributed knowledge network, designed perhaps unconsciously, but evolved through practice to survive external threats. It was information preservation technology, created thousands of years before electricity existed. The priesthood understood something fundamental. If knowledge exists in only one place, it can be destroyed. If it exists in multiple forms, in multiple locations, in multiple minds, it becomes nearly impossible to completely eliminate. Among the fragmentary records that survived ancient Egypt, hidden in temple walls, encoded in temple calendars, embedded in seemingly religious texts, scholars have begun identifying what appears to be a sophisticated astronomical record-keeping system of almost incomprehensible precision. The Egyptian calendar wasn't arbitrary. The 12-month system, the 360-day year, plus 5 additional days, these weren't guesses constructed from casual observation. They represent deliberate observations of astronomical cycles accumulated across centuries and carefully organized into mathematical structures. The priests tracked the heliacal rising of Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky, with such precision that their observations allowed them to create a calendar system that only deviated by 1 day every 120 years. Better accuracy than the Julian calendar would achieve 2,000 years later. Better accuracy than conventional history suggests should be possible. But beyond simple calendar keeping, Egyptian priests recorded something far more significant. In temple texts and astronomical ceilings, literal ceilings of temples, covered with star maps and astronomical notations, they documented the precession of the equinoxes. This is a celestial phenomenon so subtle that detecting it requires centuries of careful observation. Precession is the slow wobble of Earth's axis, causing the position of stars to gradually shift over a 26,000-year cycle. Modern science wouldn't formally identify this phenomenon until the Greek astronomer Hipparchus made the discovery around 130 BCE. Yet Egyptian temple records suggest the priesthood had documented this cycle 2,000 years earlier. How? There's no clear answer. Either they possessed observation methods so advanced that we don't fully understand them, or they inherited this knowledge from an even more ancient source. The question hangs in the evidence, unanswered and troubling. The priests also maintained what appears to be a comprehensive record of planetary cycles. The movements of Venus particularly fascinated them. They tracked Venus so precisely that they could predict its future positions. One surviving priestly document contains Venus observation records that scholars initially dismissed as duplicate or mistaken entries. Then modern astronomical calculations verified that the records described actual astronomical events separated by multiple centuries. This suggests the priesthood maintained continuous observation records across periods far longer than a single human lifetime. The knowledge transfer system must have been extraordinarily effective to maintain this accuracy across generations. Each generation had to receive not just the data, but the methodology for verifying and extending it. Each generation had to understand not just what to observe, but why the observations mattered. The records reveal something else as well. The priesthood didn't merely document observations passively. They analyzed them. They searched for patterns. They attempted to predict future astronomical events based on past observations. Some surviving texts appear to contain what we'd now recognize as computational methods, systematic procedures for calculating where a celestial body would appear at a future date. This represents genuine astronomical science, not mysticism, not superstition, but organized, methodical investigation of the cosmos conducted by people who understood that the work required continuity, precision, and systematic accumulation of data across generations. What makes these records particularly remarkable is their survival. Most knowledge from ancient Egypt has vanished. Most temple libraries were destroyed. Most astronomical records were lost to time and deliberate suppression. Yet fragments of these records persist, embedded in temple architecture that archaeologists have spent decades measuring and analyzing, encoded in texts that scholars have slowly begun decoding, hidden in plain sight within religious narratives that preserved scientific information beneath layers of spiritual language. It's as if the priesthood anticipated that their records would be suppressed, that institutional knowledge systems would collapse, and therefore encoded their observations in multiple forms designed to survive disruption. The knowledge waited, fragmented but persistent, obscured but recoverable, preserved in stone and text and symbol for people in later eras who possessed the curiosity and tools to extract meaning from what survived. The Egyptian priesthood understood mathematics not as an abstract intellectual exercise, but as the fundamental language through which the universe expressed itself. They didn't merely use mathematics as a tool for calculation. They recognized that mathematical relationships were woven into the fabric of reality itself. The ratios they discovered in nature, in the movements of stars, in the proportions of living things, in the structure of light and sound, they incorporated these same ratios deliberately into temple architecture and ceremonial geometry. It was intentional. It was deliberate. It was a statement made in stone and mathematical proportion. The concept of phi, the golden ratio, approximately 1.618, appears throughout nature, in spiral galaxies, in hurricane formations, in the proportions of human bodies, in the arrangement of seeds in flowers. The priesthood recognized this ratio appearing repeatedly at different scales and understood that this repetition implied something profound about reality. They incorporated phi into Egyptian temple proportions with deliberate precision. The ratios between chamber dimensions, between exterior and interior measurements, between aligned architectural features, all encoded this mathematical principle. They weren't decorating temples. They were embedding knowledge into stone. They were creating permanent records that would communicate to future generations. This ratio matters. This proportion appears everywhere. Understanding it is essential to understanding the universe. They also understood and applied complex geometric concepts that wouldn't be formally studied in Western mathematics for thousands of years. Harmonic proportions, recursive patterns, self-similar forms that repeat at different scales. They incorporated these concepts into temple layouts and architectural alignments. The priesthood maintained what we might call mathematical mysteries, problems and principles passed down through generations as teaching tools. These weren't entertainment puzzles. They were methods of transmitting knowledge about fundamental relationships governing the cosmos. Some of these problems, when decoded by modern mathematicians, revealed solutions to practical challenges Egypt faced. Water distribution systems, architectural load-bearing calculations, astronomical prediction refinements. The priesthood encoded practical problem-solving within mathematical frameworks that appeared purely theological to observers lacking training to interpret them. They apparently understood basic principles of what we'd now call geometry, trigonometry, and early calculus-like concepts. The precision with which they calculated volumes, areas, and angular relationships testifies to this. They could determine the volume of irregularly shaped containers. They could calculate the height of structures using angular measurement. They could work with proportional relationships to scale architectural designs. This mathematical sophistication shouldn't exist at their historical moment according to conventional understanding. Yet the evidence of its application persists throughout their surviving monuments and texts. The priesthood also recognized number sequences and patterns that held what they considered sacred significance. The number 12 represented cosmic order. 12 lunar months approximate a solar year. 12 appeared throughout their mythology. The number 7 represented completeness. 7 notes in a musical scale complete an octave. 7 days in their ceremonial cycles. The number 40 represented transformation and trial. But these weren't arbitrary. They were based on actual patterns observed in nature and the cosmos. The priesthood observed natural patterns, encoded them into numerical systems, and then embedded these systems into religious symbolism. This ensured that knowledge would be repeated, taught, and transmitted across generations, even by people who didn't fully understand the mathematical foundations. The symbols carried the data. The rituals carried the patterns. The stories carried the principles. It was perhaps the most sophisticated knowledge preservation system ever devised. By connecting mathematical principles to religious symbolism, the priesthood ensured that their knowledge would survive institutional collapse. Only someone with complete training could extract the original scientific principles. But even untrained transmission would preserve essential patterns accurately enough for future scholars to reconstruct. The encoding was layered, nested, designed to communicate at multiple levels depending on the observer's knowledge. To an uninitiated person, it was religious narrative. To a trained priest, it was technical information. To modern scholars with appropriate analytical tools, it becomes partially decipherable again. The priesthood weaponized mathematics. They embedded it into every aspect of their civilization. And the remarkable thing is, we can still extract the original knowledge from symbols and architecture they left behind, if we know where to look and possess sufficient patience to interpret what they built. The priesthoods of ancient Mesopotamia approached the cosmos with a fundamentally different mindset than their Egyptian counterparts. Where Egyptian priests observed celestial bodies with reverence, approaching the sky as something sacred and unknowable, Mesopotamian priests examined it like engineers confronting a machine. They didn't merely want to know where celestial bodies were positioned. They wanted to understand why they moved as they did. They wanted to develop models, predictive frameworks, systems that would allow them to calculate where a planet would appear months or years in advance. This represents a shift in philosophical orientation. Egyptian knowledge sought harmony with cosmic order. Mesopotamian knowledge sought to manipulate and predict that order. Both approaches yielded profound understanding, but through different methodologies. The Mesopotamian priesthood is credited with developing the zodiac, the division of the ecliptic, the sun's apparent path through the stars, into 12 segments. Scholars typically treat this as merely a convenient calendar system, a practical solution to organizing celestial observation. In reality, it represented something far more sophisticated. It was a mathematical tool of remarkable elegance. By dividing the sky into 12 segments, they created a coordinate system that allowed priests to map the positions of celestial bodies with remarkable precision. More significantly, it allowed them to predict future planetary positions with accuracy that modern analysis has found startling. The system worked, repeatedly, consistently, across extended periods of observation. The Mesopotamian priesthood maintained a continuous record of astronomical observations inscribed on clay tablets in cuneiform. These weren't rough notes, jotted down by casual observers. These were precise numerical records. They documented the positions of the moon and planets with specific coordinates. They recorded eclipses with dates and times. They noted anomalies in celestial movements. The level of numerical precision in these records is extraordinary by any standard. Babylonian astronomers calculated the period of lunar eclipses to within a few minutes of modern measurements. They tracked the movements of Venus with such accuracy that they could identify and correct for systematic errors in their observations. Think about what that means. They recognized that their observations contained errors. They developed methods to detect those errors. They applied mathematical corrections to improve accuracy. They understood something fundamental about scientific methodology, that precision requires not just careful observation, but systematic error analysis and correction. The priesthood developed the concept of angular measurement as we understand it today, dividing the circle into 360 degrees. This wasn't arbitrary. It's a highly practical system that allows for convenient division into multiple intervals. The use of 60 as a base number, the sexagesimal system in Mesopotamian mathematics, further refined astronomical calculation. The convenience of this system is so significant that we still use it today. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. We inherited it directly from the Mesopotamian priesthood. Their mathematical innovations didn't merely solve ancient problems, they shaped how all subsequent astronomy would be practiced. They literally created the mathematical language that modern astronomy still employs. A priesthood existing thousands of years before the scientific revolution invented fundamental tools that remained central to scientific practice. The priesthood apparently understood that some celestial phenomena repeated in cycles of remarkable length. They tracked Venus as both morning star and evening star, noting that this appearance cycle seemed periodic and predictable. Modern analysis of surviving records suggests they possessed observation data spanning centuries, perhaps longer. Similar to the Egyptian model of knowledge transmission across generations, the Mesopotamian priesthood maintained continuity of observation across time periods, far exceeding individual human lifespans. Each generation inherited not just conclusions but raw data from previous generations. Each generation added its observations to the accumulated record. Each generation trained successors in the precise methods required to maintain consistency and accuracy. What emerges from this is a picture of a priesthood approaching astronomy as a methodical scientific enterprise, not mysticism, not superstition, but organized investigation guided by mathematical principles and commitment to precise measurement. They understood that patterns emerge only from sufficiently large datasets. They understood that observation required systematic methodology. They understood that knowledge transmission demanded precision and verification. They were, in essence, practicing science thousands of years before the scientific revolution supposedly occurred. Their tools were different, their theoretical frameworks were different, but their fundamental commitment to observation, measurement, mathematical analysis, and predictive modeling that was science. Among the fragmentary records that survived from Mesopotamian priesthoods, scattered across museum collections and archaeological sites, there are references to astronomical events that shouldn't have occurred according to conventional understanding of celestial mechanics. The records describe what appears to be a dramatic celestial phenomenon, possibly a bright comet blazing across the sky, possibly a meteoric shower of unusual intensity, possibly an extraordinary planetary alignment of unusual character. Whatever it was, it provoked profound concern among the priesthood. The surviving texts suggest they responded with urgency. They applied every principle of their accumulated knowledge, attempting to predict when this phenomenon would recur. They compiled historical records. They searched for patterns in previous observations. They apparently engaged in frantic calculations. Their effort was intense and sustained, yet their conclusion, if we interpret the fragmentary surviving evidence correctly, was disturbing. They couldn't predict when or even if such an event would occur again. This realization appears to have profoundly unsettled the priesthood. They had constructed sophisticated mathematical models. They had accumulated centuries of precise observations. They had developed predictive frameworks that worked reliably for planetary movements and eclipse cycles. Yet something had appeared in the sky that their models couldn't explain. Something that contradicted their understanding of how the cosmos operated. Their careful systems of prediction had failed. There were variables in the universe that they hadn't accounted for, forces or phenomena that existed outside their theoretical frameworks. The knowledge they possessed, however sophisticated, was incomplete. The priesthood's response to this realization reveals something crucial about their intellectual character. They didn't retreat into mysticism. They didn't declare the phenomenon divine and therefore unknowable. They didn't suppress evidence that contradicted their theories. Instead, they intensified their efforts to record and preserve astronomical data. It's as if they understood that future generations would need comprehensive records to make sense of what had occurred. If the current generation couldn't predict or fully explain this phenomenon, perhaps future generations, armed with better mathematical tools or additional observation data, could reconstruct understanding. The priesthood made a strategic decision. They would document everything with greater precision. They would expand their record-keeping. They would ensure that no observation was lost. There's evidence suggesting the priesthood began investigating alternative cosmological models. Some surviving texts describe concepts that sound almost modern in their sophistication. Ideas about the cosmos being ordered according to predictable principles. Speculations about what forces or entities might drive observed celestial motions. These speculations never developed into formal mathematical models. The priesthood apparently lacked the mathematical tools required. But the intellectual activity itself is remarkable. The priesthood was thinking in sophisticated conceptual frameworks. They were wrestling with fundamental questions about cosmic mechanics. They recognized that their understanding was incomplete, and they were attempting to develop better frameworks. The broader context is that Mesopotamian priesthoods experienced a period of intense innovation and concern following this astronomical anomaly. They seem to have understood that conventional knowledge might be insufficient for future challenges. They invested enormous effort into developing better models and more comprehensive record-keeping systems. The temple libraries expanded. Record-keeping became more systematic and organized. Training for priests intensified. It's as if the priesthood recognized they were facing a knowledge crisis. Their certainty about cosmic order had been shaken by the appearance of something they couldn't explain or control. Their response was to recommit to the fundamental principle underlying all their work. Observe carefully, record precisely, transmit faithfully to future generations. Future generations would need the accumulated data to understand. This response reveals something profound about the priesthood's conception of knowledge. They understood that knowledge isn't created by individual researchers in isolated moments of insight. Knowledge is accumulated, transmitted, refined across generations. It requires systematic observation across extended periods. It requires institutions capable of maintaining continuity across decades and centuries. It requires commitment to precision even when the purpose isn't immediately clear. The priesthood had confronted the limits of their understanding. Rather than giving up, they deepened their commitment to the systematic practices that had made their achievements possible. They prepared for a future when understanding might be possible. The Mesopotamian priesthood's approach to knowledge preservation differed significantly from the Egyptian model, yet was equally sophisticated. Where Egyptian priests embedded knowledge into architecture and relied on continuous temple operations and visual alignment, Mesopotamian priests created extensive written records on clay tablets and organized them into systematically managed temple libraries. These weren't casual collections of records accumulated haphazardly over time. They were sophisticated institutional repositories. The organization suggests advanced thinking about knowledge management. Temple libraries appear to have been systematically organized with categories of knowledge, cross-referencing systems, and apparent indices that allowed priests to locate specific information on particular topics. This reveals something important about the priesthood's mindset. They weren't interested in hoarding knowledge for mystical purposes or restricting access merely to maintain power. They wanted knowledge to be accessible and usable. They created what amounts to ancient databases, information systems, designed for retrieval and application. The Library of Nippur, a collection of clay tablets from ancient Mesopotamia, preserved and studied by modern scholars, reveals organizational sophistication that surprises those expecting primitive record-keeping. The texts were grouped by subject matter. The groupings suggest cataloging systems. Indices allowed navigation through the collection. The priesthood had solved a fundamental organizational problem that would plague human civilizations for millennia. How do you organize large quantities of information so that it remains accessible and doesn't become lost? They developed systematic approaches to this problem thousands of years before modern library science emerged. The Mesopotamian priesthood pioneered the use of the zodiac as an organizational framework for knowledge itself. By dividing conceptual space into categories corresponding to zodiacal regions, or broader conceptual areas, they created a system that was simultaneously systematic and flexible. New knowledge could be incorporated into the system without disrupting the overall organization. If a priest discovered new information about agricultural practices, it could be integrated into the existing framework. If observation revealed new astronomical phenomena, there was a designated place for that information within the organizational system. The framework could expand without becoming chaotic. The priesthood also maintained what appears to be deliberately separated branches of knowledge. Practical knowledge, agriculture, construction, medicine, was organized distinctly from theoretical knowledge encompassing cosmology, mathematics, and philosophy. This compartmentalization served multiple strategic purposes. Specialists could focus deeply on their specific domains, developing expertise without needing to master everything. The separation provided redundancy. If one knowledge domain was lost or corrupted, other domains remained intact and functional. It prevented catastrophic vulnerability, where the death of a single keeper of knowledge would eliminate essential information. Different priests maintained different specializations. The knowledge system survived individual losses. The priesthood also pioneered what we might recognize as knowledge translation. They discovered that technical knowledge could be adapted into narrative or poetic forms that were easier to transmit orally and more resistant to forgetting. Complex mathematical principles were embedded into narrative frameworks. Astronomical observations were encoded into stories about the gods. Practical medical knowledge was formatted into incantations. The beauty of this system was that it didn't require the person transmitting the knowledge to fully understand underlying principles. A storyteller could recite narratives faithfully, even without grasping the mathematical principles embedded within them. Yet someone with training could extract the original technical information from beneath the poetic language. It was steganography, information hiding in plain sight within culturally accepted frameworks. Stories that functioned as both entertainment and knowledge containers. This multi-layered preservation strategy ensured remarkable resilience. Knowledge existed in multiple forms simultaneously. If written records were destroyed, oral traditions persisted. If oral traditions were suppressed, knowledge survived in stories deemed culturally important. If stories were forgotten, architectural alignments and artistic representations preserved encoded information. No single catastrophe could eliminate everything. The priesthood had designed a knowledge system resistant to disruption through deliberate redundancy and clever encoding. They understood that knowledge preservation required not just accumulation, but systematic organization, multiple storage media, and encoding methods that made information survivable, even if its original institutional context collapsed. The Hindu priesthood, custodians of the Vedic texts, possessed something that, when examined closely, appears almost impossible. They developed a method for preserving knowledge that seems to violate what we understand about how human memory works. The Vedas, composed around 1500 BCE, possibly earlier, have been transmitted orally across approximately 3,500 years of human history. Not written down and passed through libraries. Not preserved on clay tablets in temple archives. Memorized, spoken aloud. Transmitted from teacher to student, generation after generation, across an unbroken chain of more than 140 generations. When Western scholars finally managed to compare different versions of these texts, preserved by different schools in different geographic regions, they discovered something troubling. The variations were less than 1 to 2% across 35 centuries of human transmission. Think about what that means. Texts transmitted through human memory alone, across more than 1,000 years longer than recorded history before the texts were even written down, with error rates lower than modern computer systems achieve when replicating digital data. How is this possible? The answer reveals something profound about the priesthood's understanding of the human brain, knowledge so sophisticated that modern neuroscience is only now beginning to verify and formalize what the priesthood apparently understood intuitively thousands of years ago. The Vedic priesthood organized texts according to sophisticated rhythmic and phonetic patterns. This wasn't poetic embellishment. It was engineering applied to the fragile medium of human memory. By embedding knowledge into patterns that the human brain naturally recognizes as correct or incorrect, they created self-correcting transmission systems. The brain is wired to recognize pattern deviations. When something disrupts an established pattern, alert systems activate. A word out of place, a syllable mispronounced, a rhythm disrupted. These errors are immediately noticeable to someone trained in the text. They stand out as discordant. This allows for nearly automatic error correction. If a student recites a passage with an error, both student and teacher recognize it immediately. The mistake is obvious. The correction is obvious. The pattern reasserts itself. The error dies in transmission. The priesthood understood the relationship between sound and memory at a level that's remarkable. Specific phonetic patterns, when repeated aloud, create neural pathways that make information memorable and retrievable. They recognize that certain sound combinations are inherently sticky. They remain in memory with minimal conscious effort. Other combinations are slippery. They resist retention. The priesthood designed the Vedic texts to exploit this principle extensively. Every word was chosen, not just for meaning, but for its acoustic properties, the way it sounded, how it felt in the mouth, how it created pathways in the brain. This is a form of neurotechnology. Technology applied directly to human cognition. Furthermore, the priesthood organized information hierarchically. Core concepts were transmitted first and most frequently. Secondary information was built upon the foundation of core concepts. Tertiary information was organized according to relationships with secondary information. This hierarchy created a safety mechanism. If a student couldn't correctly recite core material, teachers detected the problem immediately. They didn't discover the corruption only when attempting to transmit dependent information. The error was caught early, corrected, integrated properly before the student proceeded further. The system was designed to fail safe. The priesthood apparently understood neurolinguistics, how the brain processes and stores different types of language. Different information required different encoding. Practical information was formatted as imperative statements, instructions, commands. The brain retains procedural information efficiently when formatted this way. Conceptual information was formatted as metaphors or analogies. The brain understands abstract concepts through comparison to concrete experience. Procedural information was embedded into narrative sequences, stories. The brain retains procedural steps when they're organized into narrative arcs. Each format optimized the brain's ability to store and retrieve that specific type of information. The priesthood wasn't just preserving knowledge. They were engineering how the brain would process and retain it. There's evidence suggesting the priesthood employed what modern neuroscience recognizes as spaced repetition and retrieval practice. Students learned texts. Then they were tested on them. Then they were tested again, with intervals of increasing duration between tests. This reinforces memory and prevents forgetting. Modern cognitive psychology has verified this principle, increases long-term retention dramatically. The priesthood called this process recitation. In reality, it was sophisticated application of principles we're only now formalizing through neurological research. They were practicing cognitive science without the terminology. The priesthood maintained a system of specialists. Some priests memorized the Rig Veda exclusively. Others specialized in the Yajurveda. Still others focused on the Samaveda. This specialization meant each individual wasn't required to memorize the entire collection. Error rates decreased because the memory burden was distributed. But it also meant knowledge was distributed across multiple individuals. No single person's death would eliminate information. The priesthood also developed standardized recitation methods. Specific pronunciations, specific rhythms, specific intonations. These weren't arbitrary choices made for aesthetic reasons. They were optimized for clarity and memorability. They were chosen because these particular sounds and patterns worked. They adhered to human neurology. They survived transmission. Within the Vedic texts, particularly the Rig Veda and the Upanishads, there exist descriptions of cosmological concepts that are intellectually sophisticated and, in certain respects, startlingly aligned with modern scientific understanding. The texts describe a universe that is vast and old beyond human comprehension. The Rig Veda explicitly states that creation itself is unknowable. The text makes clear that the universe operates according to consistent principles called arta, or cosmic order, and that the observable cosmos is merely one manifestation of a greater underlying reality. There's a philosophical sophistication here that modern readers often miss because they expect ancient texts to be primitive and concrete. Instead, they encounter abstract conceptualization approaching metaphysics. The Upanishads venture further into territory that seems almost anticipatory of modern physics. They suggest a concept of consciousness as fundamental to reality itself, not consciousness as a byproduct of matter, but consciousness as foundational. The observer and the observed are not separate but intimately connected. This sounds almost like an ancient articulation of quantum mechanics' observer-dependent reality. It sounds like someone grappling with the recognition that observation shapes what is observed. How an ancient priesthood would arrive at such a concept without experimental evidence remains unexplained. Unless they inherited it, unless they possessed theoretical frameworks we've lost. The Vedic texts contain what appear to be sophisticated astronomical observations. The Rig Veda describes the motions of heavenly bodies and appears to contain references to specific astronomical events that scholars have been able to date to particular historical periods. Some scholars have argued that certain passages contain accurate descriptions of precession, the slow wobble of Earth's axis, causing the position of stars to gradually shift over a 26,000-year cycle. The same phenomenon that European astronomy would take 2,000 years to rediscover. The priesthood apparently understood this phenomenon in the distant past. The texts contain descriptions of complex cycles, cycles within cycles within cycles, governing celestial motions. These cycles have periods of extraordinary length, some spanning hundreds of thousands of years. Modern astronomical analysis suggests that some of these described cycles correlate with actual cosmological phenomena we're now aware of. Cycles in Earth's orbital parameters, variations in solar output, gravitational interactions within the solar system, operating across vast timescales. How the Vedic priesthood obtained knowledge of cycles so long that they couldn't possibly be directly observed remains mysteriously unexplained. They couldn't have observed a 300,000-year cycle. The priesthood didn't exist for that duration. Either they inherited the knowledge from written sources now lost, or they possessed observation records spanning millennia, or they developed theoretical models that, through sophisticated mathematical reasoning, predicted the existence of these cycles. None of these options seems particularly plausible, yet the evidence persists. The Vedic texts also contain what appear to be descriptions of atomic theory, specifically, descriptions of matter as being composed of discrete particles. The Rig Veda mentions anu or paramanu atoms, or indivisible particles. Later Vedic texts describe how these particles combine to form larger entities, how they interact, how they transform. This conceptual framework is strikingly similar to modern atomic theory. Whether the priesthood was describing a theoretical model developed through philosophical reasoning, or actual observations through early magnification devices, or inherited knowledge from an even more ancient source remains unclear. The evidence supports multiple interpretations. None is definitively proven. The texts describe principles that sound like descriptions of energy, transformation, and forces. Concepts central to modern physics, but seeming extraordinarily advanced for ancient texts. There's discussion of how matter can be converted into different forms, how energy manifests in different ways, how fundamental principles underlie observable phenomena. The priesthood also apparently explored philosophical and mathematical concepts related to infinity, zero, and the nature of number systems themselves. The Rig Veda contains some of the earliest known references to zero, not merely as a placeholder in numerical notation, but as a mathematical concept in itself. Zero as something, zero as nothing, zero as a principle. This mathematical sophistication allowed the Vedic civilization to develop number systems vastly more advanced than those possessed by most contemporary civilizations. What emerges is a picture of a priesthood engaging with cosmological and physical concepts at a level of abstraction and sophistication that shouldn't be possible at their historical moment. Unless the priesthood was far more advanced than we assume, unless they inherited their knowledge from sources we've lost, unless they possessed observation methods and mathematical tools we don't understand. The evidence doesn't resolve these questions. It simply insists that they need to be asked. The Vedic priesthood's success in transmitting knowledge across 35 centuries wasn't accidental or fortunate. It resulted from a systematic, rigorous, and deliberately designed educational process. Young men selected for priesthood training underwent years of intensive study. They weren't merely memorizing texts passively. They were learning entire frameworks of knowledge, systems of interpretation, methods for deriving new understanding from existing principles. The training included memorization, but it extended far beyond that. The students engaged in philosophical discussion. They studied mathematics. They learned practical applications of theoretical principles. The priesthood understood that knowledge preserved without understanding becomes brittle. It breaks. It corrupts. Students needed to comprehend the principles underlying what they memorized. The priesthood maintained what we might recognize as interpretation schools, different branches within the priesthood that maintained somewhat different understanding of the same texts. These weren't contradictory interpretations fighting for dominance. They were different approaches to extracting knowledge from identical source material. One school might emphasize the astronomical content. Another might focus on the philosophical implications. Another might concentrate on the mathematical relationships. This diversity served multiple protective functions. If one interpretation school was disrupted or destroyed, other schools maintained the knowledge. It also encouraged intellectual vitality. Debate between schools refined understanding and prevented stagnation. The priesthood recognized that static knowledge dies. Knowledge needs to be engaged with, questioned, refined, applied to new circumstances. The priesthood created systems for handling knowledge considered sensitive or dangerous. Certain advanced teachings were restricted to senior priests who had demonstrated sufficient understanding and reliability. This prevented misuse of knowledge, while ensuring that the most sophisticated understanding was transmitted only to those capable of comprehending and properly applying it. The priesthood made a judgment about which knowledge could be widely distributed and which required careful gatekeeping. This suggests the priesthood understood that certain knowledge could be dangerous if misapplied or if transmitted to those lacking adequate conceptual framework to interpret it correctly. The priesthood also understood that knowledge needed practical application to remain vital. Priests weren't merely custodians of ancient wisdom locked away in temples. They were expected to apply that wisdom to contemporary problems. They served as healers, astronomers, architects, counselors. This practical engagement ensured that knowledge remained useful. It prevented the calcification that occurs when knowledge becomes disconnected from application. It also enabled new understanding to develop. By applying ancient principles to novel situations, the priesthood could discover new applications and refinements. The priesthood maintained a principle that seems almost paradoxical. Knowledge should be transmitted, even if not fully understood by the transmitter. This created redundancy. Even if an intermediate generation of priests failed to understand the full implications of what they were transmitting, the text itself would preserve the knowledge. Future generations could rediscover meanings that had been temporarily lost. The priesthood understood that understanding is temporary. Each generation must recreate understanding for itself. Therefore, the knowledge had to be preserved in a form that could survive temporary loss of comprehension. It had to be encoded so robustly that it persisted even when understanding wavered. This is perhaps the most profound aspect of the Vedic knowledge transmission system. It was designed to survive the death of understanding itself. Knowledge was preserved through redundant systems, through encoding in multiple forms, through distribution across multiple practitioners and schools, through hierarchical organization that caught errors early, through alignment with how the brain actually works. The priesthood created what amounts to an intellectual insurance policy against forgetting, against misunderstanding, against institutional collapse, against cultural disruption. They understood that civilizations fall, institutions disappear, understanding can be lost. Therefore, they built systems designed not just to survive, but to enable recovery and rediscovery. The Mayan priesthood developed one of humanity's most sophisticated mathematical and astronomical systems in what is now Mexico and Central America, apparently in complete independence from any priesthood in the Old World. The remarkable aspect isn't that the Mayan system resembles systems developed elsewhere. It's that it achieved comparable sophistication through entirely different conceptual frameworks. The priesthood arrived at comparable conclusions through different paths, similar answers to similar questions, different starting assumptions, yet overlapping destinations. The Mayan priesthood organized knowledge around an extraordinarily complex calendar system. They didn't simply track the solar year like a practical farming people might need to do. They developed multiple interlocking calendars that measured time on different scales simultaneously. The Tzolk'in, a 260-day ritual calendar. The Hab, a 365-day solar calendar. The long counter system measuring days since a specific mythological date. These three calendars were integrated into a unified system of such complexity that creating that unified system required sophisticated mathematical thinking. The calendars had to align with each other precisely. They had to track different cycles simultaneously, without corruption. This required mathematics. The long count is particularly remarkable. It measured time in a base 20 numerical system. It could track dates spanning millions of years. The priesthood apparently understood that human civilization operates on vast timescales. They understood that tracking time on these scales might prove essential. The long count could measure not just centuries or millennia, but periods so extended that they encompassed multiple rises and falls of civilizations. The priesthood was thinking in deep time, geological time, cosmological time. They were creating a calendar system designed to persist across epochs. The precision of Mayan astronomical observations rivals that of modern pre-telescopic astronomy. The priesthood calculated the length of the Venus cycle, the period between successive appearances of Venus as morning star and its disappearance and reappearance as evening star, to 583.92 days. Modern measurement places it at 583.923 days. The error is less than 0.01 day over a cycle of 584 days. This accuracy is extraordinary. It required systematic observation over centuries. It required methodology that maintained precision across generations. It required knowledge transmission systems that didn't corrupt the accumulated data. The Mayan priesthood also calculated the solar year with precision that exceeded European astronomical accuracy until well into the modern era. They determined the length of the year to be 365.2420 days. The actual value is approximately 365.24219 days. The error is minimal, less than 0.0002 days. The precision suggests either observation spanning centuries of careful measurement or theoretical understanding of solar mechanics that we don't fully comprehend. Possibly both. The Mayan priesthood developed a mathematical system based on the concept of zero and positional notation centuries before this concept emerged in Europe. Zero wasn't merely a placeholder in numerical notation, though the priesthood used it that way. Zero was a conceptual entity, a number representing the absence of quantity but possessing mathematical properties. Zero as something, zero as nothing, zero as a principle. This mathematical sophistication allowed Mayan priests to perform complex calculations. It enabled them to develop increasingly sophisticated astronomical models. It permitted the kind of abstract mathematical thinking that bridges the gap between observation and prediction. The Mayan priesthood apparently understood the periodicity of eclipses. They could predict lunar eclipses with impressive accuracy. They apparently understood that solar eclipses occurred at predictable intervals, though solar eclipses are more difficult to predict because they depend on precise geographic location. Surviving Mayan astronomical texts contain what appear to be eclipse prediction tables, methods for calculating when eclipses would occur, when they would be visible from particular locations. The priesthood had developed the mathematical framework to predict these events, not through superstition or lucky guesses, through systematic application of accumulated observation data and mathematical principles. The priesthood also appears to have documented longer celestial cycles. The precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of Earth's axis, causing the position of stars to gradually shift over approximately 26,000 years, wasn't formally identified by Western astronomy until the stars' Renaissance. Yet certain Mayan astronomical texts contain references to cycles of length comparable to the precession cycle. Whether the priesthood was explicitly tracking precession or documenting other long-period astronomical phenomena remains debated. But the evidence indicates they understood that the cosmos contained cycles of extraordinary length, cycles that wouldn't complete for thousands of years, cycles that required generational observation and mathematical modeling to understand. The most profound aspect of Mayan achievement is that all this knowledge was organized within a religious and philosophical framework. The priesthood didn't compartmentalize knowledge into separate domains. They didn't separate sacred from practical. Astronomy, mathematics, and theology were integrated into a unified system. The gods represented astronomical principles, mathematical relationships. Religious ceremonies reenacted celestial cycles. Architecture embodied mathematical proportions. The positions of temples reflected cosmic order. The priesthood had created a civilization where knowledge was unified, where the sacred and the scientific weren't opposed, but integrated. This integration suggests not merely accumulated observations, but a sophisticated philosophical framework explaining how the universe works and why that understanding mattered to human civilization. The Mayan priesthood's obsessive focus on tracking vast cycles and predicting distant astronomical events suggests something beyond mere curiosity about the cosmos. They were attempting to predict something they feared, something they believed mattered for the survival of civilization. Mayan texts contain references to catastrophic events, cycles of destruction and renewal. The long count calendar apparently culminated in a significant date, December 21st, 2012, in modern calendar terms, which some scholars interpreted as marking the end of a cosmic age. Whether this represented a predicted catastrophe or merely a conceptual milestone marking the completion of a vast cycle remains debated. But the fact that the priesthood would construct an entire calendar system pointing toward this distant date indicates they were thinking in apocalyptic terms. They were attempting to understand if and when civilization-ending events might recur. This impulse to predict and prepare for catastrophic celestial events appears across multiple priesthoods. The Mesopotamian priesthood intensifying record-keeping following an unexplained celestial anomaly. The Egyptian priesthood developing sophisticated methods for preserving knowledge, even if all else failed. The Vedic priesthood committing to perfect transmission across generations. All these impulses suggest priesthoods shared a common concern: catastrophe. They were preparing for something, not through superstition, but through strategic knowledge preservation. The Mayan priesthood created elaborate architectural and artistic records of celestial events and divine history. The temples of Chichen Itza and Palenque incorporate astronomical alignments with such precision that modern archaeoastronomers can verify them using computers. The temples of Tikal seem positioned relative to celestial features. Maya stelae carved stone monuments record historical events alongside astronomical phenomena. These weren't monuments to vanity. They were information storage systems designed to preserve knowledge, even if human civilization in the region was disrupted. The priesthood understood that cities could fall, that populations could be decimated by disease or conquest. That knowledge could be lost through catastrophe. Therefore, they encoded critical information into permanent stone. They created redundant records distributed across multiple sites so that destruction of one location wouldn't result in complete loss. They positioned temples to encode information through alignment. They carved stelae to preserve records. They created a distributed knowledge preservation system encoded into the physical landscape itself. The Mayan priesthood apparently developed a system of hieroglyphic writing specifically designed to encode information densely. A single glyph could represent multiple meanings depending on context. The writing system allowed enormous amounts of information to be compressed into relatively small spaces. This enabled the priesthood to inscribe critical knowledge on monuments information that would survive even if all other records were destroyed, if temples were burned, if written records on bark paper were destroyed, if oral traditions were suppressed, the information would persist in stone. The priesthood apparently understood something else as well: the relationship between astronomical cycles and human civilization. They recognized that certain astronomical cycles might correlate with historical patterns. When particular celestial alignments occurred, specific types of events might be likely to happen on Earth. This correlation between the cosmic and the terrestrial was central to Mayan understanding. They tracked celestial cycles, not from abstract curiosity, but because they believed understanding celestial patterns provided predictive power for human affairs. They were using astronomy as a forecasting tool. They were attempting to predict not just where planets would appear, but what would happen to human civilization. The priesthood's apocalyptic focus suggests they had identified patterns in history, cycles of collapse and renewal, periods of great prosperity, followed by periods of catastrophe. They apparently believed these cycles correlated with celestial phenomena, that when the stars aligned in certain configurations, human civilization was vulnerable. When the cycles turned toward renewal, civilization could flourish. The priesthood was attempting to track when the dangerous phases of these cycles would arrive. They were preparing humanity for something, encoding warnings into monuments, preserving knowledge for future priesthoods who would face similar challenges. They were communicating across time. The Mayan priesthood maintained its knowledge systems through multiple cycles of political upheaval and social change. Kingdoms rose and fell, competing for power, engaging in warfare. But the priesthood persisted. The knowledge transfer systems were sufficiently robust that even when individual cities were conquered or depopulated, the priesthood maintained the accumulated wisdom across the broader region. Knowledge distributed across multiple locations survived the loss of any single location. Knowledge preserved in multiple forms survived the destruction of any single form. The system was resilient. It had proven resilient across centuries of internal conflict. Then, Spanish conquistadors arrived in the 16th century and initiated a process that would nearly completely destroy Mayan priesthood knowledge. Conquistadors, motivated by conquest and conversion to Christianity, viewed Mayan priestly knowledge systems as pagan superstition that needed to be eradicated. They burned temples, not accidentally during warfare, deliberately. They destroyed codices, the Mayan equivalent of books, folded bark paper covered with hieroglyphic text. They executed priests who resisted conversion. They imposed Christianity with urgency and violence. Diego de Landa, a Spanish bishop, famously oversaw the burning of Mayan codices. He destroyed what scholars can only estimate as thousands of pages of accumulated astronomical and mathematical knowledge. Landa's burning of the codices represented a deliberate decision to eliminate knowledge that existed outside the Christian framework. Whether Landa understood the value of what he was destroying remains debated. Perhaps he recognized that the texts contained advanced knowledge and burned them specifically because of that knowledge. Perhaps he didn't comprehend what he was destroying and simply viewed it as pagan superstition requiring elimination. The effect was identical regardless of his intention: catastrophic. It eliminated our direct access to Mayan astronomical and mathematical knowledge. We can never read the texts that detailed their methods. We can never study their calculations directly. What we know of Mayan science comes from fragments that survived, architectural alignments that can still be measured with modern instruments, stelae that preserved some information in hieroglyphic form, some of which has been partially deciphered. The few surviving codices that were hidden from Spanish destruction by indigenous peoples, or lost in the chaos, and therefore escaped burning. Oral traditions that continued to be transmitted, despite suppression efforts. From these fragments, modern researchers have pieced together understanding of Mayan astronomical knowledge. But we possess only fragments. We lack the comprehensive records. We lack the texts explaining methods. We lack the theoretical frameworks the priesthood maintained. The priesthood's response to this existential threat paralleled responses of priesthoods facing previous threats. They attempted to hide knowledge. They distributed it across multiple individuals. They preserved it in forms the conquerors might not recognize as valuable. Some priests adapted. They incorporated Mayan astronomical knowledge into Catholic rituals and symbolism, so it would survive within Christian frameworks. Some knowledge was preserved in indigenous communities that maintained themselves in the rainforests, hidden from Spanish control. Some knowledge was encoded into stories and oral traditions that continued to be transmitted despite official suppression. But the systematic destruction was effective. Vast amounts of knowledge were lost. The priesthood's sophisticated methods for preserving knowledge, Methods that had survived countless internal conflicts and external pressures proved insufficient against an organized campaign of deliberate destruction, combined with systematic disruption of the institutional structures through which knowledge was transmitted. The collapse of the Mayan priesthood represents a cautionary tale. It demonstrates that even sophisticated knowledge preservation systems can be destroyed if the institutions sustaining them are sufficiently disrupted. The Mayan example is particularly significant because it occurred in the historical record. We can see exactly how knowledge was lost, through destruction of written records, through execution of knowledge keepers, through suppression of institutions, providing continuity of knowledge transmission. We can trace the mechanism of knowledge collapse when it happened to the Mayan priesthood. Which raises a disturbing question. How many times did this occur in history? How many priesthoods were destroyed before our historical record began? How much knowledge was lost to similar suppression before anyone was documenting it? The priesthoods of ancient Greece operated according to fundamentally different principles than their Egyptian or Mesopotamian counterparts. Rather than maintaining centralized temple organizations, Greek priestly knowledge was distributed among philosophical schools and mystery cults. The Orphic mystery cult, the Eleusinian mysteries, the Pythagorean society. These weren't formal priesthoods in the traditional sense, but rather exclusive organizations dedicated to preserving and transmitting secret knowledge. Initiation was restricted. Knowledge was compartmentalized. Understanding deepened through stages. Those lacking commitment or proper training weren't granted access to deeper teachings. The Pythagorean society is particularly significant because it represents a clear bridge between Egyptian priesthood traditions and Greek philosophical development. Pythagoras apparently learned directly from Egyptian priests. He was initiated into Egyptian mysteries. He studied in temples. He absorbed their astronomical and mathematical knowledge. He then returned to Greece and incorporated what he had learned into his own teachings. The Pythagorean school maintained a system remarkably similar to the Egyptian priesthood model: secret knowledge restricted to initiates, a hierarchical structure providing increasing knowledge access based on demonstrated understanding and ideological commitment, a practice of presenting philosophical principles through mathematical relationships rather than narrative or poetry. The Pythagoreans made mathematical discoveries that were revolutionary by contemporary standards. What we now call the Pythagorean theorem, the principle that in a right triangle, the square of the hypotenuse equals the sum of squares of the other two sides, they formalized and proved. Yet the principle apparently was known to earlier cultures. The Egyptian and Mesopotamian priesthoods apparently understood this relationship and incorporated it into architectural and engineering practices. The Pythagoreans took what had been practical knowledge and elevated it to formal mathematical principle. They abstracted it, they generalized it, they created a theorem from practical observation. The Pythagoreans also developed sophisticated understanding of musical harmony. They recognized that musical intervals correspond to mathematical ratios. Certain ratios create consonant intervals, sounds that blend pleasantly. Other ratios create dissonant intervals, sounds that clash. This wasn't mere observation of acoustic phenomena. It revealed something profound. The same mathematical relationships that governed sound governed other phenomena. There was an underlying unity. The cosmos might be organized according to mathematical harmony. They called this concept the music of the spheres. However poetic it sounds, it represented a sophisticated insight. The universe might be understandable through mathematical relationships. Mathematics might be the language in which reality expresses itself. The Pythagoreans apparently investigated number theory, the properties of different numbers, the concept of perfect numbers, the relationships between different numbers. They apparently viewed numbers not merely as tools for counting or calculating, but as principles underlying reality itself. This approach to mathematics as fundamental to understanding the universe predates modern physics by 2,000 years. It suggests that the Pythagoreans had inherited or independently developed a philosophical framework, treating mathematical relationships as the foundation of physical reality. Plato, who came after Pythagoras, incorporated Pythagorean mathematical philosophy into his own teachings. Plato's academy was organized to transmit specific knowledge to initiates, similar to the priesthood model. Above the door to Plato's academy was supposedly inscribed, "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter here." This wasn't mere aesthetics or intellectual snobbery. It was a declaration that understanding mathematical principles was foundational to understanding reality. Plato transmitted knowledge about astronomy, particularly the cosmological model organizing celestial bodies in nested spheres. He also appears to have transmitted knowledge about the fundamental structure of matter, using geometric principles to explain how different elements might be composed of different geometric forms. Elements were made of atoms possessing specific geometric shapes. Different geometric arrangements created different material properties. Aristotle, studying under Plato's successors, systematized this knowledge. He attempted to create a comprehensive framework explaining how the universe worked. His specific models were later proven incorrect. His cosmology didn't match observational reality. His physics contradicted what modern experiments reveal. Yet his methodology, systematic observation, logical reasoning, and the attempt to create unified frameworks explaining diverse phenomena became foundational to scientific methodology. Aristotle took the fragments of priestly knowledge he had inherited and attempted to organize them into a coherent system. He failed to achieve true understanding, but he modeled the process through which understanding might be pursued. As Christianity emerged and became the dominant religion of the Mediterranean world, priesthoods that had maintained pre-Christian knowledge faced an existential choice. They could suppress their own traditions entirely and assimilate into Christianity, or they could preserve their knowledge by adapting it to Christian frameworks. Some priesthoods chose total assimilation, abandoning their traditions. Others chose strategic adaptation. They began incorporating pre-Christian philosophical and astronomical knowledge into Christian theology and mysticism. Neoplatonism, emerging in the 3rd century CE, represented a synthesis of Platonic philosophy and increasingly mystical interpretations of reality. Neoplatonist thinkers attempted to reconcile Greek philosophical traditions with emerging Christian theology. They maintained that ultimate reality transcended material form, that the divine was the source of all existence, that human consciousness could approach direct experience of the divine through contemplation and philosophical understanding. This framework allowed Neoplatonists to preserve elements of Greek priestly knowledge within a Christian theological context. The mathematical principles underlying reality could be reinterpreted as expressions of divine order. Astronomical cycles could be understood as manifestations of divine will. The cosmos could be simultaneously divine creation and mathematical system. Neoplatonism was eventually suppressed as heretical. The Christian Church deemed it too pagan, too philosophical, too independent from official doctrine. Yet Neoplatonism succeeded in transmitting many elements of Greek priestly knowledge into Christian mystical traditions. Early Christian Gnostics appear to have inherited elements of priestly knowledge, astronomical and cosmological concepts encoded into their theology. Gnostic Christianity was officially suppressed and declared heretical. Yet some Gnostic ideas persisted within less orthodox Christian communities. More significantly, Christian mysticism itself incorporated elements of priestly methodology. Medieval monasteries operated as centers of learning, remarkably similar to priesthood temples. Knowledge was compartmentalized. Access to certain teachings required demonstrated understanding and ideological loyalty. Monks engaged in meditation and contemplative practices similar to those apparently used by ancient priesthoods. The organization of monastic life created conditions for preserving knowledge across generations. The Benedictine rule established practices for monastic communities that created stable institutional structures designed to maintain continuity across decades and centuries. Individual monks lived and died, but the institution persisted. Knowledge was transferred systematically. The monastic copyists, who hand-copied manuscripts, were essentially performing a function similar to oral transmission specialists in Vedic priesthoods. They transferred knowledge from one generation to the next. Error-checking mechanisms existed to catch copying errors. Monasteries maintained scriptoriums where texts were carefully copied. Multiple copies were made to provide redundancy. Cross-checking occurred to verify accuracy. The monks didn't possess the Vedic priesthood's sophisticated understanding of neurology and memory, but they achieved comparable resilience through different methods. Importantly, the monks weren't merely passively preserving knowledge. They were actively interpreting texts, writing commentaries that explored deeper meanings in scriptural and philosophical texts. In many cases, ancient pagan philosophical texts were preserved in monasteries, not through explicit interest in preserving paganism, but through monks' intellectual interest in understanding difficult philosophical concepts that related to theological questions. A Greek text explaining cosmology might be preserved because it helped monks understand theological concepts about creation. An ancient mathematical treatise might be copied because understanding mathematical principles seemed relevant to understanding the structure of creation. The monastic scholarly tradition effectively became the repository for pre-Christian knowledge. Ancient texts that might otherwise have been destroyed were preserved within libraries, ostensibly Christian institutions. The Christian authorities who supervised monasteries often didn't fully recognize what was happening. They approved of monks studying classical texts if those texts seemed to have theological relevance. By the time organized religious authorities recognized that ancient knowledge was being preserved and transmitted within monastic communities, the practice was thoroughly institutionalized. The monastic system was integral to Christian civilization. Stopping the preservation would have required dismantling institutions central to the Church's own functioning. The priesthoods had successfully adapted. They had embedded themselves within Christian institutions so thoroughly that they became inseparable from Christianity itself. As European civilization emerged from the medieval period into the Renaissance, scholars began encountering ancient texts preserved in monastic libraries. They were simultaneously encountering texts brought from the Islamic world, civilizations that had maintained Greek and Roman texts that had been lost in Europe. The encounter with these ancient texts triggered what historians now recognize as the first phase of modern scientific methodology. Scholars like Leonardo da Vinci, Nicolaus Copernicus, and Galileo Galilei began investigating nature directly. Rather than relying entirely on ancient authorities or religious doctrine, they conducted observations, they performed experiments, they compared theoretical predictions with observed reality. Yet they were simultaneously influenced by ancient texts. They studied mathematical principles outlined by Pythagoreans. They were inspired by Plato's and Aristotle's attempts to create systematic understandings of nature. Copernicus's heliocentric model, the theory that Earth orbited the Sun rather than the Sun orbiting Earth, appears to have been influenced by Aristarchus of Samos, an ancient Greek astronomer who had proposed that Earth orbited the Sun. Aristarchus's model had been preserved in ancient texts, but suppressed by mainstream Greek and medieval Christian thought because it contradicted accepted models. It was incompatible with Aristotelian physics. It seemed to contradict religious cosmology. Yet Aristarchus had proposed it. The possibility existed. Copernicus studied the ancient texts, rediscovered the possibility, and developed the theory further. The Renaissance scholars' relationship to ancient texts was complex. On one hand, they were developing new methodologies that went beyond ancient texts. They were observing phenomena that ancient authorities hadn't documented. They were measuring things with greater precision than ancient technology allowed. They were testing theories experimentally. On the other hand, they were drawing inspiration from ancient ideas that had been lost or suppressed during intervening centuries. They were recovering fragments of ancient priestly knowledge and using those fragments to rebuild understanding of nature. Ancient knowledge was seed material for new inquiry. The significance of this moment is that the priesthood's fundamental project, preserving knowledge through multiple forms and across time, was beginning to succeed. Knowledge that had been fragmented, suppressed, and nearly lost was being recovered. But there's a tragic element as well. The priesthood's sophisticated integrated systems of knowledge were being recovered only as fragments. The context that gave the knowledge meaning was lost. A mathematical principle survived without the cosmological framework that explained why it mattered. An astronomical observation survived without the philosophical tradition that gave it significance. The Renaissance recovery was real, but it was incomplete. It recovered pieces of the puzzle, but lost the picture the puzzle was meant to create. The priesthoods had organized knowledge within unified frameworks. Mathematics related to astronomy, related to philosophy, related to practical application. Remove the framework, and the pieces lose context. They become isolated facts, stripped of the meaning the priesthood embedded within them. A mathematical principle becomes abstract notation. An astronomical observation becomes raw data. The unifying vision that showed how everything connected together is gone. Furthermore, as organized religion became concerned about scientific inquiry that seemed to contradict religious doctrine, new forms of suppression emerged. Scientists faced accusations of heresy. Books were banned. Inquisitions were launched. Heliocentrism was declared heretical. Evolution was forbidden. The priesthood's methods for preserving knowledge, embedding it in philosophy, transmitting it through education, adapting it to cultural frameworks, were being used by others now to suppress knowledge. The machinery of knowledge preservation had been repurposed into machinery of knowledge suppression. The same institutional structures that could protect knowledge could also constrain it. The same methods that could preserve could also restrict. Across priesthood traditions globally, separated by continents and centuries, there exist consistent references to catastrophic events. Floods that destroyed civilizations, fires that consumed landscapes, celestial disturbances, periods of prolonged darkness. These narratives appear in Mesopotamian texts, in Vedic literature, in Mesoamerican records, in Norse mythology, in Aboriginal Australian traditions, in Native American oral histories. The consistency is remarkable. The details vary. The core element remains: catastrophe, disruption, civilization threatened or destroyed. Conventional interpretation treats these narratives as purely mythological. Moral lessons dressed in narrative form, stories about spiritual transformation or divine judgment. Yet modern geological and paleontological evidence suggests something different. Human civilization has indeed survived multiple catastrophic events. The evidence is preserved in geological strata, in ice core data, in paleoclimatic records, in the fossil record documenting mass extinction events. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, while controversial among mainstream scientists, suggests that around 12,800 years ago, a celestial impact event occurred. An asteroid or comet fragment striking Earth. The impact would have caused dramatic climate disruption, triggered wildfires, disrupted agriculture across the northern hemisphere, caused mass extinction of megafauna species, potentially collapsed human civilizations that had been developing in the Pleistocene era. If such an event occurred, it represented an extinction-level threat to human civilization, a catastrophe of unprecedented scale, the kind of event that would reshape human consciousness and behavior for generations afterward. Priesthoods that emerged after such a catastrophe would have had powerful incentive to develop systems for tracking celestial bodies. To understand what had occurred, to develop methods for predicting whether similar events might occur again, to create institutional structures capable of maintaining vigilance across centuries and millennia. The priesthood's obsessive focus on astronomical observation, their development of extremely long-term calendar systems measuring millions of years, their apparent attempts to predict apocalyptic events, all of this takes on new significance if priesthoods were aware of the existence of past catastrophic events. They weren't speculating about hypothetical future disasters. They weren't engaging in superstitious anxiety. They were responding rationally to evidence that their ancestors had experienced genuine existential threats. They were attempting to prevent recurrence of events that had already devastated their ancestors. The catastrophe had occurred. The civilization had survived. The surviving priesthoods understood that it could happen again. Therefore, they invested in systems to detect warning signs and potentially predict when conditions might be right for recurrence. Geological evidence suggests that the Holocene epoch, the current geological epoch beginning approximately 11,700 years ago, coinciding with the emergence of human civilization as we know it, has experienced multiple climate disruptions, severe drought periods, sudden cooling events, rapid climate shifts that would have posed significant challenges to developing human civilization dependent on agriculture and stable climate patterns. The priesthood's records and myths appear to reference these events specifically. Flood narratives appear across dozens of cultures. The Mesopotamian flood myth, the Hebrew Noah narrative, Hindu flood stories, indigenous American flood narratives, These aren't isolated coincidences. They appear to reference actual climate disruptions, periods when sea levels rose dramatically, when rivers flooded beyond normal bounds, when coastal populations were displaced. When agricultural lands were inundated, different cultures in different regions experienced these events and preserved memory of them through narrative. The narratives incorporated spiritual and moral elements, but preserved factual content about what had occurred. Myths of eternal winter or ages of darkness appear in Norse, Mesoamerican, Hindu, and other traditions. Ragnarok in Norse mythology. The Mayas' description of cyclical world destruction. Hindu cosmological cycles including periods of chaos and disruption. Aboriginal Australian accounts of ancestral times when catastrophic change occurred. These aren't merely poetic imaginings. They appear to be culturally preserved memories of actual climate disruptions or celestial events. Volcanic eruptions that blocked sunlight. Periods of rapid cooling. Events that seem to darken the sun and bring winter conditions where they shouldn't occur. The priesthoods apparently understood that such events had occurred before and could occur again. This understanding transformed their fundamental approach to knowledge preservation. They developed astronomical observation systems specifically designed to detect the signs that preceded such events. They created calendar systems capable of projecting into the distant future to identify when conditions might be right for catastrophic recurrence. They recorded their observations with obsessive precision, apparently believing that future generations would need to analyze the accumulated data to understand when catastrophe might strike again. This explains something that has mystified historians and scholars: the priesthood's apparent obsession with cycles, particularly astronomical cycles of extraordinary length, cycles that wouldn't complete for thousands or tens of thousands of years. Why would a priesthood invest such effort in tracking phenomena they would never live to see complete? Why would they create calendar systems measuring millions of years into the future? The answer is that they weren't merely satisfying curiosity. They were engaged in a practical project, attempting to identify patterns that might predict future catastrophes. They were the first risk management specialists in human history. Using the best understanding of celestial mechanics available to them, they attempted to assess existential threats to human civilization. They understood that some threats operate on timescales longer than human lifespans. Therefore, systematic institutional observation, maintained across generations, was necessary to detect patterns that individual human observation couldn't perceive. Within the most sophisticated priestly texts, particularly Vedic texts and Mesoamerican astronomical records, there are references to what might be interpreted as a cosmic cycle or pattern of extraordinary length. References that suggest the priesthoods had identified something about the structure of celestial mechanics that most modern people have overlooked. The Hindu concept of the yugas, vast ages of cosmic time, organized into cycles, suggests awareness of patterns spanning hundreds of thousands of years. The Mayan long count system tracks time in a way that implies comparable awareness of extraordinarily long cycles. Modern astronomical observation has identified real celestial phenomena operating on such timescales. The precession of Earth's axis, the slow wobble causing stellar positions to gradually shift, completes a cycle spanning approximately 26,000 years. Variations in Earth's orbital eccentricity and axial tilt operate in cycles spanning tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of years. Gravitational interactions within the solar system operate on timescales of millions of years. Complex patterns emerge when multiple cycles interact. When cycles align, their combined effects can be dramatic. The priesthoods appear to have understood that celestial mechanics involved multiple cycles operating simultaneously and interfering with one another. When multiple cycles aligned, in particular configurations, certain conditions might emerge. Conditions that could either be favorable or catastrophic. The priesthoods may have been tracking when these cycles would next align in ways that historical records suggested preceded major disruptions. This would explain their investment in calendar systems of such precision and covering such vast timescales. They were attempting to identify the dangerous windows, the periods when multiple celestial cycles aligned in configurations that history suggested preceded catastrophic events. If their calculations suggested that such an alignment was approaching, their entire civilization might be motivated by urgency. the urgency of preventing consequences or preparing for them. This also explains the priesthood's apparent belief that knowledge preservation across extremely long timescales was essential. If catastrophic events occurred every tens of thousands of years, a priesthood emerging after such an event might rationally believe they had hundreds of thousands of years of relative safety. But they would also believe it essential to record their observations and understanding so that priesthoods emerging in future epochs could prepare when the next dangerous window approached. The priesthoods were engaging in transgenerational knowledge transfer, communicating across millennia to warn future epochs of potential threats. Their entire knowledge preservation apparatus, their commitment to perfect accuracy, their obsessive attention to astronomical observation, all of it makes sense if they were engaged in this trans-temporal communication project. They were essentially sending messages to the future, encoded in mathematics, encoded in astronomical alignments, encoded in architecture and monuments designed to outlast civilizations. Messages saying, "Pay attention, watch for patterns, understand what we have learned. We are preparing you for a threat we know may come." The priesthoods apparently understood that they couldn't prevent cyclical catastrophe. They couldn't stop the celestial mechanics that governed cosmic cycles. But they could prepare. They could create knowledge systems that would allow future generations to understand what was approaching. They could encode warnings into forms that would survive disruption and suppression. They could distribute knowledge so thoroughly that no single catastrophe could eliminate it completely. They could train successive generations in the methods and principles that would allow understanding to be recovered and refined. The priesthoods may have even believed that understanding these cycles provided some form of predictive advantage, that if future generations understood the patterns, they could prepare, could build institutions and knowledge systems capable of surviving disruption, could preserve the information necessary to rebuild civilization, could emerge from catastrophe with continuity of knowledge rather than complete reset. The priesthoods were attempting something profound. They were trying to create institutional memory that could span catastrophes, knowledge systems resilient enough to survive civilization collapse. This framing transforms how we understand the priesthood's apparent apocalyptic preoccupation. They weren't pessimistic or fatalistic. They were engaged in strategic preparation. They recognized that catastrophe was possible, perhaps likely on geological timescales. Therefore, they invested in systems designed to preserve knowledge and understanding across those timescales. They were saying to future generations, "This is what we know. This is what we believe may be coming. This is what you will need to know if catastrophe arrives." Among the knowledge that priesthoods guarded most carefully were what might be called survival technologies, practical information about agriculture, medicine, water management, construction, social organization. If catastrophe struck, this was the knowledge that would determine whether survivors could rebuild functional civilization or spiral into chaos and gradual extinction. The priesthoods maintained detailed knowledge about plant cultivation, which crops were optimal for different climates, which plants possessed medicinal properties, which combinations of crops maintained soil fertility by rotating nitrogen-fixing plants through fields. This wasn't superstition or folk wisdom. It was empirical, agricultural science developed through centuries of careful experimentation and observation. Trial and error refined into systematic knowledge. The priesthoods also maintained sophisticated medical knowledge. Egyptian priesthoods possessed remarkable understanding of anatomy and disease treatment. They apparently performed surgery, identified disease symptoms and their treatments, understood principles of hygiene and infection prevention. This knowledge was encoded partly in written texts, but also in training. Practical knowledge passed from experienced healers to apprentices. Methods and principles embedded in memory and practice so they could persist even if written records were destroyed. Medical knowledge was probably one of the most carefully guarded priesthood specializations because it directly affected survival and reproduction. The priesthoods maintained knowledge about water management, construction of irrigation systems, identification of water sources in arid regions, purification and distribution of water to populations. This knowledge was essential to civilization, particularly in arid and semi-arid regions where civilization had developed. The priesthoods apparently understood hydraulics and engineering principles sufficient to construct sophisticated water systems that functioned reliably across centuries. The precision and durability of Egyptian irrigation infrastructure testifies to the priesthood's engineering knowledge. The priesthoods also maintained knowledge about construction, principles of engineering that allowed for the creation of stable structures, optimal architectural designs for different purposes, efficient use of materials. The precision and durability of pyramid construction, temples, and other structures testifies to the priesthood's architectural knowledge. This knowledge had practical value. It allowed civilization to build structures that protected people from elements and disaster. Beyond practical survival knowledge, the priesthoods maintained what might be called organizational knowledge, systems for governing societies, maintaining social cohesion, coordinating large-scale projects. The priesthoods understood human psychology, motivation, and social dynamics at a level we rarely appreciate. They had developed systems for inspiring cooperation, maintaining order across large populations, motivating people toward common goals. This organizational knowledge was perhaps most valuable of all. A group possessing technical knowledge but lacking organizational ability to coordinate effectively would be unable to rebuild civilization. Individual survival knowledge would be insufficient. Collective coordination would be essential. The priesthoods invested heavily in transmitting organizational principles, partly through explicit teaching and training, partly through ritual and ceremony that trained people in hierarchical organization and coordinated action. People who participated in synchronized religious rituals learned how to move together, coordinate timing, maintain discipline. These weren't merely spiritual exercises. They were training in organizational behavior and group coordination. The priesthoods also apparently maintained knowledge about conflict and negotiation. Surviving texts contain what appear to be strategic and diplomatic principles: how to negotiate favorable terms, how to organize military forces effectively, how to manage resources efficiently during scarcity. This knowledge was necessary for survival in a competitive world where multiple groups might be competing for limited resources following catastrophic disruption. What makes this knowledge particularly significant is that it was compartmentalized and distributed. Different priesthoods in different locations maintained somewhat different knowledge specializations. This ensured that no single catastrophe could eliminate all essential knowledge. If one region's priesthood was destroyed, other regions maintained comparable expertise. The priesthoods also ensured that knowledge was transmitted to people outside the priesthood itself, to skilled craftspeople, healers, administrators. If the priesthood institution itself was destroyed, the knowledge would persist in the broader population. This was another form of redundancy. Knowledge wasn't solely dependent on institutional preservation. It was embedded in human expertise, distributed across civilization. The priesthoods understood that institutions can collapse. But if knowledge is distributed widely enough, embedded in human practice and skill, it can survive institutional collapse and enable rebuilding. The transformation from priesthood knowledge systems to institutionalized religion involved far more than simple doctrinal disagreement or theological debate. It represented a fundamental shift in how knowledge was organized, who was permitted to access it, and what happened when knowledge contradicted approved doctrine. Early organized religions, particularly Christianity, as it became institutionalized through the first centuries CE, faced a choice about how to relate to pre-existing priestly knowledge systems. They could incorporate that knowledge, adopting priesthood wisdom, into the religious framework. They could suppress it completely, declaring it heretical and forbidding its transmission. Or they could compartmentalize it, allowing certain individuals, priests, monks, scholars, to maintain ancient knowledge while ensuring it remained inaccessible to the general population. Institutionalized Christianity largely pursued a combination of all three strategies. At the institutional level, ancient knowledge was compartmentalized. Certain scholars and theologians had access to ancient texts. They were permitted to study them. But this study occurred within strict boundaries. Any conclusions that contradicted religious teachings were forbidden. Knowledge deemed consistent with religious doctrine could be preserved and studied. Knowledge deemed inconsistent was suppressed. This created what we might recognize as a filter. Pre-Christian knowledge passed through a doctrinal filter, and only portions that survived the filtering process were permitted to be studied and transmitted to future generations. The significance of this filtering is profound. It distorted knowledge transmission at a fundamental level. Scientific principles that made sense within their original context were separated from that context. Mathematical and astronomical knowledge was preserved, but often without the cosmological frameworks that explained why it mattered. Practical knowledge was preserved, but was often reframed in religious terms that obscured its practical utility. The knowledge became abstract, disconnected, stripped of meaning. The institutional religious framework required commitment to specific doctrines. Doctrines that sometimes contradicted observations and understanding, preserved in ancient texts. When conflict arose between institutional religious doctrine and ancient knowledge, the institution took steps to suppress the knowledge. The Copernican heliocentric model contradicted church doctrine about Earth's centrality to creation, therefore it was suppressed. Research into anatomy that suggested the human form was mechanically determined rather than divinely designed was discouraged. Investigation into Earth's history, suggesting geological processes required much longer timescales than religious chronologies allowed, was suppressed. The machinery of suppression was not primarily violent, though violence did occur. It was primarily institutional and structural. Scholars who pursued research contradicting doctrine faced career consequences. Their work was not published, or was published only in restricted formats accessible to few. Their students were prevented from pursuing similar research. Academic positions at universities were denied. Funding for research was withheld. Access to libraries was restricted. The impact was extraordinarily effective because it didn't require dramatic persecution. Research that contradicted religious doctrine didn't need to be violently destroyed. It simply couldn't be pursued. It couldn't be published. It couldn't be funded. It couldn't be discussed openly. Researchers caught pursuing suppressed lines of inquiry faced professional ruin. Talented scholars learned that pursuing research contradicting doctrine was career suicide. They would be cast out, discredited, denied positions and funding. Their life's work would be destroyed. Therefore, they didn't pursue it. The brightest minds learned to avoid certain questions, to steer clear of certain research paths. The institutionalization of ignorance became self-sustaining. No explicit suppression was necessary. The system simply made certain research impossible to pursue. Imagine a young scholar with ambition, intelligence, and curiosity. He recognizes contradictions between religious doctrine and observed reality. He wants to investigate, but he understands that doing so would end his career. It would result in accusations of heresy. It would isolate him from the intellectual community. It would prevent him from publishing, teaching, or accessing resources necessary for research, so he doesn't pursue it. He finds research questions that don't threaten doctrine. He advances within the system. Other talented scholars make the same calculation. The result is an entire intellectual culture organized to avoid certain questions. This is subtler and more effective than violent suppression. Violence creates martyrs. Violence creates controversy. Violence makes suppression obvious. But institutional suppression simply makes certain inquiry impossible. It's bureaucratic, procedural, seemingly neutral. No one is censoring you explicitly. It's just that funding isn't available for that research. Positions aren't open in that field. Publishers aren't interested in those conclusions. The mechanisms are invisible. The effect is total. The priesthood's most sophisticated achievement was not the preservation of individual facts or isolated principles. Any civilization could accumulate facts. Any culture could record observations. The priesthood's genius was the creation of integrated frameworks that explained how different pieces of knowledge related to one another, how they formed coherent wholes. Mathematical principles were embedded within cosmological understanding. Astronomical observations were connected to philosophical frameworks. Practical technologies were integrated into comprehensive systems that explained why they worked. When the priesthood's institutional structures collapsed and knowledge became fragmented across different institutions and contexts, the frameworks themselves were lost. Later civilization retained certain pieces. A mathematical principle here, an astronomical observation there. But the coherent systems that explained how the pieces fit together were fragmented beyond recovery. The picture was lost. Only pieces remained. Consider music and astronomy. The priesthoods understood that mathematical ratios governed both musical harmony and astronomical cycles. These weren't separate domains with superficial similarities. They were expressions of the same underlying principle. The same ratios that created consonant musical intervals appeared in the orbital periods of planets. The same proportions that produced pleasing harmonies appeared in the structure of temples. It was unified knowledge, a single principle expressing itself through multiple manifestations. As knowledge fragmented, this unity dissolved. Music theory developed as a separate discipline. Astronomy developed separately. Architecture developed separately. Modern scholars study these fields independently. They don't naturally recognize the underlying connections because the frameworks explaining those connections were lost. The priesthood's integrated understanding was permanently lost. We possess the pieces, but not the picture. This fragmentation was accelerated by the institutional processes through which knowledge was preserved. As monasteries and universities became the primary institutions preserving knowledge, knowledge was organized according to institutional categories. Different scholars specialized in different domains. The integration that had characterized priestly knowledge transmission was replaced by specialization and compartmentalization. Specialization permitted deeper investigation within specific domains. It allowed experts to develop sophisticated understanding within narrow fields, but it prevented the kind of cross-domain insight that characterized priesthood systems. It prevented someone from recognizing that music and astronomy were expressions of the same principle, because no one person studied both. The loss of interpretive frameworks was particularly devastating. The priesthoods maintained not just knowledge, but methods for interpreting and applying that knowledge. They possessed philosophical traditions, explaining what knowledge meant, how it could be applied, how new understanding could be developed. When institutional religion suppressed certain philosophical traditions and reinterpreted others through religious doctrine, the interpretive frameworks were transformed beyond recognition. Consider a priesthood ritual that had practical psychological effects. Perhaps it reduced anxiety. Perhaps it enhanced group cohesion. Perhaps it improved focus and attention. The priesthood maintained principles explaining why the ritual produced these effects. When religion reinterpreted the ritual as purely spiritual or magical rather than practical, the interpretive framework changed. Future generations might preserve the ritual itself, but entirely lose understanding of why it actually worked. They would maintain the practice as religious devotion, while lacking knowledge of its genuine mechanisms. Furthermore, the loss of context meant that symbols lost their meaning. The priesthoods used symbols densely. A single symbol could express mathematical relationships, astronomical alignments, philosophical principles. But symbols disconnected from their interpretive frameworks become merely decorative or arbitrarily mystical. A symbol that originally expressed a mathematical principle might, without context, be interpreted as expressing magical meaning. The distinction between mathematical meaning and magical meaning might seem clear to modern readers, but it's a distinction that only emerged after centuries of separation. To people without access to the priesthood's interpretive frameworks, the distinction was unclear. When knowledge is preserved in pieces, separated from the frameworks that gave it coherence, it becomes impossible to reconstruct understanding. You possess facts but not meaning, data but not understanding. You have pieces, but the picture they were meant to form is permanently lost. The priesthood's greatest vulnerability was not that their knowledge could be forgotten. It was that their knowledge could survive in fragmented, decontextualized form, unable to be understood or applied or integrated into coherent systems. Pieces preserved, picture lost, understanding impossible. Throughout history there are moments where the loss of priestly knowledge was not gradual or incidental but dramatic and deliberate. The burning of the Library of Alexandria, the Spanish destruction of Mayan codices, the Chinese emperor's burning of books and burying of scholars, Islamic scholars fleeing persecution, the suppression of scientific research contradicting religious doctrine. These events are documented. They represent deliberate decisions to destroy knowledge and suppress voices that possessed it. They represent moments when institutions recognized that certain knowledge threatened their power and took action to eliminate it. The significance of these moments is that they target not just specific facts, but entire knowledge systems. When priesthoods were persecuted or suppressed, the institutional continuity that sustained knowledge transmission was broken. Students couldn't continue their education under masters. Apprentices couldn't learn from experienced practitioners. Libraries were destroyed, and the redundancy that protected knowledge was compromised. Knowledge that had been distributed across multiple locations and multiple minds suddenly concentrated in fewer individuals. That concentration became vulnerability. One consequence was that certain pieces of knowledge survived, while others were completely lost. The survival was largely random. Whatever happened to be hidden or overlooked survived. Whatever was exposed to destruction was lost. Another consequence was that survivors of persecution often had to transform their knowledge to preserve it. They had to encode it, hide it, reinterpret it through acceptable frameworks. This survival often meant that knowledge was distorted, transformed beyond recognition, made acceptable through reframing. The priesthoods that survived persecution were often the most ingenious at adaptation. They were creative in finding ways to preserve knowledge within new constraints. But this adaptability came at a cost. The knowledge that survived was no longer what it had been. It had been transformed, compressed, reframed. The priesthoods that survived persecution were often the most transformed from their original form. Furthermore, when survivors attempted to transmit their knowledge to new generations, they often had to do so in circumstances of scarcity and risk. Knowledge couldn't be transmitted comprehensively as it had been in secure priestly temples. It had to be condensed into the most essential elements, hidden in code or allegory, embedded in cultural practices or folklore. This compression and encoding ensured that knowledge survived, but at the cost of complexity and nuance. The knowledge that emerged from centuries of persecution was far simpler and more distorted than the original priestly knowledge. Centuries of refinement were lost, sophisticated frameworks were reduced to fragments. There's also evidence suggesting that some suppression of priestly knowledge was quite deliberate and strategic, undertaken by organizations that recognized that certain knowledge threatened their power. Organized religion recognized that priesthoods possessed knowledge and authority independent of religious institutions. This independence was a threat to religious authority. Therefore, organizations invested effort in suppressing priestly knowledge, in ensuring that future generations would lack the tools to reconstruct it. This was particularly true regarding knowledge related to astronomy and mathematics that contradicted religious cosmology. Authorities recognized that if people had access to accurate astronomical observations and correct mathematical frameworks, they could determine that religious cosmological models were incorrect. Therefore, they restricted access to such knowledge. They prevented its study. They ensured that those who did possess it were discredited or persecuted. They created conditions where the pursuit of such knowledge became genuinely dangerous. The machinery of suppression was multifaceted. Some suppression was violent, execution of heretics, burning of libraries. Some was institutional, denial of funding, suppression of publication. Some was cultural, discrediting of knowledge systems as superstition or primitive thinking. Together, these suppression mechanisms were extraordinarily effective. They didn't merely prevent the transmission of knowledge. They created conditions where possessing such knowledge became genuinely dangerous. Pursuing it could result in death. Speaking it publicly could result in imprisonment. The result was silence, enforced ignorance. Knowledge died not because it was forgotten, but because speaking it became impossible. Architecture, particularly the temples and monuments constructed by priesthoods, represents something remarkable. It's a durable record of priestly knowledge encoded into physical form. Unlike written records that can be burned, unlike oral traditions that can be suppressed, unlike institutions that can be destroyed, architecture persists. Stone endures. Monuments survive. The knowledge the priesthoods embedded into physical structures has waited thousands of years for someone to recognize what was hidden within it. The priesthoods understood something profound about preservation. They recognized that if knowledge was encoded into the very structure of buildings, it would survive regardless of what happened to written records or institutional systems. Pyramids aligned to specific stars, temples positioned to capture sunlight on particular celestial dates. structures built with proportions reflecting mathematical relationships. All of this represents knowledge surviving in physical form, even when written records disappeared and oral traditions were suppressed. This principle extended to structures built long after the original priesthoods had disappeared. Medieval cathedrals, built under Christian authority, nonetheless frequently embody mathematical principles and astronomical alignments that reflect pre-Christian priestly knowledge. The builders of these structures incorporated geometric and proportional relationships, expressing principles originally understood by priesthoods. Whether the builders fully understood the meaning of what they were building remains unclear. Often they didn't, but the knowledge survived embedded in stone regardless. The geometric principles can be extracted through careful measurement and analysis. The astronomical alignments can be verified through observation and calculation. Modern researchers, analyzing ancient structures with precision measurement instruments, have discovered alignments and proportions of such exactness that they testify to the astronomical and mathematical sophistication of the priesthoods that designed them. The precision is sometimes startling. Angles, calculated with accuracy exceeding what should be possible without modern instruments. Proportions, matching mathematical constants with remarkable precision. These weren't accidents. They weren't lucky guesses. They were intentional encodings of knowledge. Symbols encoded on monuments and structures similarly preserve knowledge. The priesthoods used symbol systems, geometric patterns, zodiacal signs, astronomical indicators as a form of data storage. Careful analysis of symbol systems appearing across different priesthood cultures reveals consistent elements. The same symbols appear in Egyptian temples, in Mesopotamian ziggurats, in Hindu temples, in Mesoamerican pyramids. This consistency suggests either cultural transmission or independent discovery of the same principles. The symbols themselves are far more than decorative. They're components of encoding systems. A trained person could extract specific information from careful analysis of symbols. Mathematical relationships, astronomical observations, procedural sequences. The priesthoods were encoding technical information in visual form, creating information storage systems that could survive translation into different languages or cultural contexts. If conquerors couldn't read your written language, they couldn't suppress your written records. But symbols carved into stone endured. They communicated across language barriers. They preserved knowledge independent of linguistic understanding. Geometric patterns are particularly significant. Certain patterns, spirals, fractals, recursive forms, appear with remarkable consistency across priesthood cultures. Modern analysis has identified that these geometric patterns reflect mathematical principles that priesthoods apparently understood. Some patterns aren't arbitrary. They reflect physical phenomena observed in nature. Spiral patterns appear in galaxies, in hurricanes, in DNA helices, in seashells, in the growth patterns of plants. Priesthoods, observing nature carefully, would have noticed these patterns appearing repeatedly at different scales, similar spirals in the vast cosmos and in the smallest living things, similar proportions governing celestial cycles and governing human bodies. They apparently understood that similar patterns appearing at different scales reflected some underlying principle, what modern science recognizes as scaling principles or fractal geometry. This was sophisticated mathematics. Mathematics without formal notation, but grounded in observation of natural reality. The priesthoods encoded these observations into symbols and architectural forms. They ensured that the knowledge would survive even if written explanations were lost. A person in a future age, examining a carved spiral on a temple wall, could measure its proportions, could compare them to spiral galaxies in the sky, could begin to understand that some principle unified them. The priesthoods were leaving messages, messages in stone, messages in geometry, messages designed to communicate across time to people who would need to understand what had been known before. The priesthood's commitment to transmitting knowledge through multiple media meant that if one medium was destroyed, others persisted. Among the most durable media were narrative and ritual. Stories and practices that served cultural significance were less likely to be suppressed. They could be transmitted without formal institutional support. They could survive in oral tradition within families and communities. They could be maintained within cultural identity even when official institutions were destroyed. The priesthoods developed what might be called embedded narratives, stories that appeared to be about mythological events or spiritual matters but that actually encoded technical information. A flood narrative might encode information about water management or hydrological cycles, how water behaves during extreme conditions, how to construct barriers and drainage systems, how to predict flooding patterns. A person reading the story for entertainment would experience a tale about divine punishment. Someone with training would extract the technical information about water management. A creation narrative might encode cosmological understanding. The sequence of events in the story might reflect cosmological principles. The relationship between different elements might reflect astronomical observations. The timeline might encode information about cosmic cycles. A person without training would experience a spiritual explanation of how the universe began. Someone trained in the priesthood's methods would recognize the cosmological principles embedded within the narrative structure. A hero's journey narrative might encode procedural information about steps that needed to be taken in sequence, how to respond to crisis, how to organize resources, how to coordinate people toward common goals. The hero's adventures might represent different procedural steps that must be completed in order. The obstacles overcome might represent challenges that would be encountered in actual implementation. This encoding strategy was extraordinarily effective because narratives are easy to remember and transmit. They're culturally valued. They can be told for entertainment while simultaneously transmitting technical information. Religious and cultural authorities were less likely to suppress narratives with obvious spiritual or cultural significance, even if those narratives encoded technical information. Ritual practices similarly encoded information. A priesthood ritual, appearing to serve spiritual purposes, might actually train people in mathematical relationships, in astronomical observation, in coordinated action. The ritual would be performed repeatedly. Participants would internalize the patterns and relationships embedded in the ritual, without necessarily understanding consciously what they were learning. The body would learn what the conscious mind wasn't taught. Archaeological and anthropological analysis of surviving rituals sometimes reveals sophisticated structural organization, reflecting mathematical or astronomical principles. Some surviving rituals, when analyzed carefully, appear designed to train participants in procedural sequences valuable in specific circumstances: emergency response to natural disasters, systematic agricultural practices, construction techniques. The ritual was a teaching tool disguised as spiritual practice. The priesthoods also embedded knowledge into music, dance, and physical movement. Musical patterns encode mathematical relationships. The intervals between notes follow mathematical ratios. The rhythmic patterns contain proportions. Dance movements encode procedural sequences. The positioning of dancers reflects astronomical relationships. The sequence of movements mirrors procedures that need to be executed in order. These embodied forms of knowledge are remarkably persistent because they're part of cultural practice that might be maintained long after the original context is forgotten. A dance that originally encoded agricultural procedures might be maintained in cultural tradition long after the agricultural context has changed. The dance persists as folk tradition, as entertainment, as cultural practice. But the mathematical or procedural relationships encoded in the dance remain intact. Someone with training to analyze the dance could extract information about agricultural practices, information that would have been completely lost if priesthood institutions had been destroyed. Furthermore, jokes, riddles, and wordplay often encoded information. Priesthoods apparently maintained knowledge in humorous forms. A joke that appeared to be mere entertainment might encode an astronomical observation, a mathematical principle, a medical procedure. This encoding strategy was particularly effective because humorous material is frequently repeated, remembered, and transmitted across generations. People might forget serious scientific information but remember a joke or riddle that encodes that information. The priesthoods apparently understood this psychology. They deliberately encoded information in forms likely to be retained and transmitted through cultural processes independent of institutional support. Modern researchers, archaeologists, mathematicians, astronomers, and historians have begun the process of rediscovering and reconstructing priesthood knowledge from the surviving fragments. This rediscovery process has revealed something remarkable. The surviving fragments, when reassembled carefully, suggest a sophisticated understanding of natural principles that priesthoods possessed. The understanding wasn't primitive, it wasn't superstitious, it was advanced, systematic, based on careful observation and rigorous thinking. Modern analysis of pyramidal geometry has revealed mathematical relationships of such precision that they required sophisticated understanding of geometry and proportion. Angles calculated with accuracy that still surprises researchers, proportions encoding mathematical constants, interior chamber dimensions reflecting astronomical cycles. The builders weren't fumbling toward understanding. They were applying sophisticated mathematical knowledge to create permanent records in stone. Modern analysis of astronomical alignments has verified that priesthoods tracked celestial phenomena with accuracy that exceeds what should have been possible without advanced instrumentation. Temple alignments pointing to stars that rise at specific times, structures oriented to capture sunlight on particular dates. The precision is sometimes exact enough that modern surveyors are impressed. It suggests either extraordinarily careful observation across centuries or theoretical understanding allowing prediction without direct observation, or both. Modern linguistic and mathematical analysis of encoded texts and symbols has begun revealing information that priesthoods embedded into cultural materials. Scholars have started recognizing patterns, understanding how information was encoded, beginning to extract meaning from symbols and narratives that appeared meaningless when viewed in isolation. The decryption process is ongoing. Many encodings remain obscure. Many frameworks of understanding remain lost. But the fragments that have been deciphered suggest that what was lost was far more sophisticated than we typically imagine. The priesthoods weren't primitive mystics attempting to understand a confusing world through superstition. They were sophisticated researchers attempting to understand natural principles and to preserve that understanding for future generations. They conducted observations. They performed calculations. They developed theoretical models. They created systems for transmitting knowledge across centuries. They anticipated that knowledge would be suppressed and designed preservation systems to survive suppression. Some modern researchers have begun realizing that the priesthood's fundamental project, the trans-temporal transmission of knowledge, designed to survive catastrophe and institutional collapse, was extraordinarily prescient. The priesthoods apparently understood that knowledge systems are fragile, that institutional structures can collapse, that human civilization itself might face existential threats. Therefore, they designed redundant preservation systems. They encoded knowledge in multiple forms. They distributed knowledge across multiple priesthoods and locations. They embedded knowledge in cultural practices and architectural forms that would persist even if explicit institutions were destroyed. The priesthoods were creating backups of human knowledge, anticipating that future generations might need to recover that knowledge from fragmented, encoded, and culturally embedded sources. They were sending messages across time. This fundamental insight that knowledge systems must be redundantly preserved because institutions are fragile represents wisdom that has proven remarkably applicable to modern contexts. In an age of digital information and institutional uncertainty, the priesthood's principles of redundant knowledge preservation have practical relevance. We face similar challenges. Information systems dependent on institutional continuity. Knowledge threatened by deliberate suppression. The need to preserve understanding across periods of disruption. But we're only beginning to understand and appreciate what the priesthoods were trying to communicate. The fragments survive. The encoded information persists. The monuments stand with their mathematical alignments intact. But the ability to fully interpret what the priesthoods left behind requires that we develop the frameworks and methodologies to extract meaning from the surviving fragments. The rediscovery process has barely begun. Researchers are still learning how to read ancient encodings, still discovering alignments and proportions they hadn't recognized before, still identifying patterns in myths and rituals that suggest hidden information. What remains to be discovered could reshape our understanding of ancient civilization, could reveal capabilities we didn't realize priesthoods possessed, could provide insights into questions we haven't yet learned to ask. One of the most mysterious aspects of priestly knowledge systems is their apparent ability to make astronomical predictions with accuracy that shouldn't be achievable without instrumental observation. The Mayan priesthood calculated the Venus cycle, the period between successive appearances of Venus as morning star, to 583.92 days. Modern measurement confirms 583.923 days. The error margin is negligible. The Babylonian priesthood predicted lunar eclipses with accuracy exceeding within hours. The Egyptian priesthood apparently understood precession, a celestial phenomenon requiring observation across centuries or sophisticated theoretical understanding. Yet here's the puzzle that modern analysis has struggled to address. Even with careful observation, certain astronomical phenomena would be extraordinarily difficult or effectively impossible to predict without mathematical models going beyond simple pattern recognition from accumulated observations. How did priesthoods develop these predictive capabilities? The question admits multiple interpretations. One possibility is that they inherited the knowledge from even more ancient sources. If an even more ancient civilization possessed sophisticated astronomical understanding and transmitted that knowledge through priesthood lineages across multiple cycles of cultural collapse and reconstruction, earlier priesthoods might have possessed frameworks that later priesthoods maintained even without fully understanding them. Knowledge could persist through institutional continuity even when conceptual comprehension was partially lost. A framework could be transmitted and applied without complete understanding of underlying principles. Another possibility is that priesthoods developed theoretical models. They may have used geometry and mathematics to model celestial mechanics. They derived predictions through logical reasoning from observations, rather than relying on observation alone. The surviving texts suggest this may have occurred. Ancient texts contain references to cosmological models and theoretical frameworks, attempting to explain why celestial bodies moved as they did. These weren't merely descriptive, they were attempts at mechanical explanation, efforts to create systems that could generate predictions. A third possibility is that priesthoods possessed observation technologies now lost to history. Perhaps they had developed instruments or methods for observation beyond simple naked-eye astronomy. Certainly they possessed remarkably effective tools: water clocks for measuring time with consistency independent of weather, instruments for measuring angles with precision, methods for record-keeping that allowed them to accumulate multi-century observations with systematic organization. But perhaps they possessed more sophisticated technologies. Some researchers have suggested that certain ancient devices might have functioned as early telescopes or instruments for angular measurement, more precise than we'd typically expect from the historical period. The Antikythera mechanism is particularly significant. An ancient Greek device discovered in a shipwreck, it appears to function as a sophisticated astronomical calculator, a mechanical device that could be used to predict astronomical events. The existence of such a device demonstrates that ancient priesthoods possessed the mechanical sophistication to create instruments going well beyond what we typically associate with ancient technology. The Antikythera mechanism's complexity suggests that its creator understood sophisticated principles of mechanics and mathematics. The device contained gears arranged to perform calculations. It represents computational technology. The sophistication is remarkable. This device also suggests that such technologies might have been more common than surviving examples indicate. Most ancient devices would have been destroyed through time and neglect. Most would have been lost to decay or deliberately destroyed during periods of institutional suppression. Perhaps priesthoods developed a range of observational and computational technologies, most of which have vanished completely. Perhaps temples contained instruments for measurement that were later destroyed or repurposed beyond recognition. Perhaps knowledge of how to construct such devices was transmitted orally and lost when practitioners were executed or scattered. The capability to predict astronomical events with startling accuracy suggests that priesthoods possessed something, whether theoretical understanding, observational technologies, or inherited knowledge that modern analysis has not fully explained. This unexplained predictive capability suggests lost knowledge or capabilities. If priesthoods could predict what should have been unpredictable, they were operating from understanding we don't fully possess. Either they understood principles about celestial mechanics that modern astronomy has only rediscovered recently, or they possessed technologies or methodologies that have since been lost. possibly both. What's particularly striking is that their predictive accuracy sometimes exceeded what would be achieved by European astronomy for thousands of years after their knowledge disappeared. The Maya calculated solar year length to greater precision than European calendars achieved. The Babylonians understood eclipse cycles better than Greek astronomy for centuries afterward. This suggests they weren't making incremental improvements through trial and error. They possessed frameworks and methodologies that allowed them to achieve accuracy that later civilizations would have to struggle to recapture. The knowledge represented genuine understanding, not luck, not coincidence. Understanding sophisticated enough to generate accurate predictions across centuries. Astronomical prediction was only one capability that priesthoods apparently developed. The evidence suggests they created other technologies and possessed other forms of sophisticated understanding that modern analysis has largely overlooked. Architectural capabilities that allowed them to construct structures of remarkable durability and precision. Medical capabilities enabling them to perform procedures and develop treatments modern science had to rediscover. Understanding of mathematics and physics that went far beyond what we'd expect from ancient civilizations without modern education or instruments. The precision of Egyptian pyramid construction demonstrates engineering capability of extraordinary sophistication. The Great Pyramid's dimensions encode mathematical relationships with accuracy that shouldn't be achievable without formal mathematics. The angles are calculated with precision, exceeding what surveyors achieve without modern instruments. The internal chambers incorporate proportions and alignments, suggesting understanding of geometry beyond what we attribute to the period. The priests who commissioned these structures apparently understood principles of load-bearing engineering, materials science, and structural mechanics. They understood how to move enormous stones precisely, how to align them with accuracy, how to create structures that would endure millennia. The priesthoods also apparently developed medical capabilities. Egyptian medical texts describe surgical procedures, pharmaceutical preparations, and diagnostic methods. Some Egyptian medicines, when analyzed by modern chemists, contain compounds with genuine medicinal properties. The priesthoods apparently understood pharmacology through systematic observation and experimentation. They identified plants with therapeutic properties. They determined effective dosages. They understood how to combine compounds to enhance effects. This was empirical medicine. Science through careful observation. The priesthoods maintained sophisticated knowledge about agriculture and water management. They understood irrigation principles, allowing them to manage water in arid regions. They developed crop rotation systems maintaining soil fertility. They apparently understood principles of hydrology and hydraulics. They built irrigation infrastructure that functioned reliably across centuries. Some systems constructed by ancient priesthoods still function today, if properly maintained. The engineering sophistication is evident in their durability. The priesthoods apparently developed psychological and neurological knowledge. Their understanding of how rituals affected consciousness suggests knowledge of human neurology. Their development of memory enhancement systems demonstrates understanding of cognitive processes. Their ability to organize large populations through coordinated ritual suggests understanding of human psychology and social dynamics. The Vedic priesthood's memorization systems represent neurotechnology, technology applied directly to human cognition. The priesthoods also apparently possessed administrative and organizational knowledge. They coordinated the construction of enormous structures. They organized large populations toward common goals. They maintained institutional continuity across centuries and decades. The sophistication of their administrative systems is evident in what they accomplished. They didn't merely govern, they created systems for governing that persisted across multiple generations. The priesthoods apparently understood navigation and possibly long-distance travel by water. Evidence of ocean voyages by ancient peoples remains controversial and debated. But some researchers argue that similarities in boat design and navigation techniques across distant regions suggest cultural contact. If priesthoods did develop ocean navigation capability, this would represent knowledge subsequently lost. Technology that was suppressed or abandoned and then forgotten. What's particularly striking is how broadly distributed these capabilities were. Different priesthoods across different civilizations apparently developed sophisticated understanding across multiple domains. The Egyptian priesthood developed engineering capabilities. The Mesopotamian priesthood developed mathematical and astronomical frameworks. The Vedic priesthood developed psychological and neurological understanding. The Mayan priesthood developed astronomical and mathematical sophistication. The Greek priesthood attempted to synthesize and systematize all of this. It appears that priesthoods across the ancient world were engaged in sophisticated research programs. They weren't merely maintaining ancient superstitions or religious practices. They were systematically investigating natural phenomena. They were applying observations to practical problems. They were developing frameworks, allowing prediction and control. They were creating knowledge systems that functioned reliably. The breadth of these capabilities across different priesthoods suggests either a shared knowledge base or that sophisticated understanding emerged independently across cultures in response to shared problems. Knowledge loss typically doesn't occur uniformly across all domains. Some knowledge survives better than others. Practical knowledge, embedded in skilled practice, often survives better than theoretical frameworks. Knowledge encoded in physical artifacts survives better than knowledge dependent on written records or oral tradition. But when institutional collapse occurs, when priesthoods maintaining and transmitting knowledge are disrupted, suppressed, or destroyed, loss can occur rapidly across multiple domains simultaneously. The mechanism works like this. Knowledge dependent on institutional transmission requires trained individuals to receive that knowledge, understand it, and transmit it to the next generation. If the institutional structure is disrupted and trained individuals are dispersed, imprisoned, or killed, the transmission breaks. The knowledge that one generation understood may not be fully transmitted to the next generation. That next generation possesses fragmentary knowledge but lacks complete frameworks. The next generation after that possesses only scattered pieces. By the third or fourth generation, what was once sophisticated understanding has degraded to folk knowledge or superstition. The original context is forgotten. The principles become magical rather than mechanical. Multiple factors accelerate this degradation. If practitioners are forbidden from practicing their knowledge, they can't develop or refine it. Skills become rusty if not practiced. If students can't be trained in traditional apprenticeship systems, the tacit knowledge that experienced practitioners possess is lost entirely. Tacit knowledge can't be written down. It must be learned through demonstration and practice. If written records are destroyed, explicit knowledge is lost. If practitioners are scattered geographically, the network effects that allowed priesthoods to maintain knowledge across regions are disrupted. One priesthood or scholar can maintain knowledge in isolation for a limited time. But institutional knowledge systems depend on networks of practitioners capable of sustaining knowledge through disruptions. When networks are destroyed, knowledge dies with them. The priesthoods understood this vulnerability. Their commitment to redundancy, geographic distribution, and multimedia encoding represented attempts to create knowledge systems resilient to institutional collapse. They encoded knowledge in multiple forms. They distributed it across multiple locations. They maintained networks spanning regions. But even sophisticated systems have limits. Sufficiently severe disruption can overwhelm redundancy. Sufficiently distributed suppression can interrupt networks. Sufficiently effective destruction of records can eliminate explicit knowledge. Historical examples demonstrate catastrophic knowledge loss. The Library of Alexandria's destruction eliminated countless texts. The burning of Mayan codices eliminated written records of astronomical and mathematical knowledge. The suppression of Greek and Roman texts eliminated philosophical and scientific knowledge during the medieval period. Each event demonstrated that knowledge can be lost through deliberate destruction combined with institutional collapse. Vast amounts of learning were permanently erased. The priesthoods apparently recognized this vulnerability and attempted to prepare for it. They couldn't guarantee survival of all knowledge. They could create redundant systems and encode knowledge in multiple forms, increasing probability that fragments would survive. But they couldn't eliminate the risk that sufficiently severe disruption would result in catastrophic loss. They could only hope that enough survived that future generations could recover and reconstruct understanding. What's tragic is that the priesthood's efforts were only partially successful. Fragments survived, but the frameworks connecting fragments were largely lost. The contexts explaining meanings were disrupted. The ability to interpret surviving knowledge was scattered across isolated traditions. Later civilizations possessed pieces without understanding how pieces fit together. They could measure pyramid proportions without understanding the cosmological principles they encoded. They could observe astronomical patterns without grasping the underlying mechanics. They possessed data without frameworks, facts without meaning. The priesthood's legacy is fragmented. They invested centuries of effort to preserve knowledge for future generations. Some of that effort succeeded. Fragments persist, but much was lost. The knowledge that might have guided human civilization through challenges remains inaccessible. The frameworks that gave knowledge meaning are gone. We inherit pieces of something profound, but can't fully comprehend what we inherited.